Please welcome Rose as she performs The Long Journey Home, Song for the Forgotten Australians.
It's been a long journey home to find a place to call my own. It's been a long journey home, but as I look around I see you and I know I don't walk alone. Traveled from London to Molong early in the spring of 1948. Said goodbye to my mother at the Seven Oaks Cafe with a cup of tea and a slice of cake. My mother hid her tears as she walked away. She said, son, you'll get an education, you'll be better off this way. But she didn't know, and they didn't care, and I was just a child. They packed up my big brown suitcase with finery and brand new shoes, and we set sail on a big ocean liner with servants like some luxury cruise, and we sailed past the pyramids of Egypt and straight up the Suez Canal, and we gazed at the Rock of Gibraltar. Oh boy, if none could see. It's been a long journey home to find a place to call my own. It's been a long, long journey home, but as I look around I see you and I know I don't walk alone. I don't walk alone. Oh, We came from many different places, from near and far, far away, and they promised us oranges and sunshine. I'm gonna learn me some better ways. But it was harsh, it was cruel, we helped each other to survive, and the pain of good intentions still sleeps with me at night. Cause the wonderful promises were terrible lies. I guess you had to be there to see it through a child's eyes. It's been a long journey home to find a place to call my own. It's been a long journey home, but as I look around I see you and I know I don't walk alone. I don't walk alone.
I would just like to say that when I wrote that song, I watched the documentaries of the Forgotten Australians. I watched Oranges and Sunshine, and I read David Hill's amazing book, The Forgotten Australians, The Long Journey Home. And so that first chapter, that first verse was actually lifted out of this eloquent Australian man who became the chairman of the ABC, or CEO. That was his own account of the goodbye he had to his mother. It's almost lifted word for word. So I just wanted to say that every child that goes into care vividly remembers that day, whether there's a record that exists or not. And certainly I had my own very vivid imprint. I'm so blessed to be a songwriter. I take all of those memories and those visions and I craft something beautiful with that, and that becomes part of my own therapy and transformation. I hope you have a wonderful day and are inspired. You are the change makers, and as a former child in care, I just say thank you.
Thank you, Rose. What a fantastic start, and I think a really fitting reminder too of the power of words and story. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and may I also extend a particular welcome to care leavers. My name is Katrina Stratton. I'm the Coordinator of Research and Evaluation at Wansley, and I also am a board member of Forgotten Australians Coming Together, the governing body of Tuart Place, and I am your MC for this afternoon. On behalf of Tuart Place and the Setting the Records Straight initiative, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's WA State Records Workshop. We have a number of purposes that we're aiming and striving to meet out of today. We want to first highlight the issues surrounding access to historical records for care leavers, to identify ways that access can be improved for people, learn from the past to identify how both record keeping and access to those records can be improved for the children and young people who we care for today. And finally, to consider the use of the DSS access principles, which are available on your table and which, of course, you've all read anyway as part of your pre-reading exercise, and how they can be endorsed and implemented in Western Australia. So to achieve those purposes, the afternoon is organised essentially into two parts. First of all, we're going to hear from a number of stakeholders about the state of record keeping and access in Western Australia. And following afternoon tea, there will be an interactive workshop led by Dr. Joanne Evans from Monash University to progress adoption and implementation of the access principles for our particular setting in WA. The inevitable couple of housekeeping items. The toilets are literally immediately outside those doors. In the unlikely event of a fire, please follow the directions of hotel staff who will assist us towards the exits. This is a non-smoking venue. Please take a moment to turn your mobile phone off or to silent. Not vibrate, because we still hear that. We'll have a break for afternoon tea at approximately 3 o'clock, and the day's proceedings will finish by 5 p.m. The event, as you can see, is being filmed and photographed, and if you don't wish to appear in any of these, can you please advise our event coordinator, Jo Hocking? There's Jo, so you know who it is that you're advising. Finally, and most importantly, obviously some of the issues that we are discussing today are deeply personal for care leavers. So if there are care leavers in the room who find the contents upsetting in any way, please make yourself known to any of the staff or board members of Tuart Place, and we'll make sure that we connect you to one of our counsellors who is present here today. To provide an acknowledgement of country, let me introduce you to Marlene Jacamara. Marlene is a citizen of humanity and a lifelong campaigner for social justice and human rights. Thanks, Marlene.
Thank you to everybody. This is the acknowledgement of the traditional owners. I honour those that came before me, my family and people who left a legacy of what it is to be extraordinarily courageous and loving human beings. The records have helped me know how to understand my own extraordinary family, a priceless gift. Despite intergenerational systemic grave injustices, I know they were never defeated. I acknowledge the First Nations peoples of this region and nation. I honour the people that came before me and the ones that will follow in our footsteps now and into the future. I, Marlene Jacamara, as a stolen generation person, want to honour the forgotten Australians and the child migrants who came out as children, and some still carry the burden of what happened to them in these institutions. I embrace the children that never return to find their parents and families. Sometimes when we did return, we were strangers in our own, to our own. Not everything was joyous. I'm deeply honoured. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. That was beautiful. It is now my pleasure to invite Commissioner Andrew Murray to officially launch today's workshop. Appointed in 2013 as a Royal Commissioner on the Australian Government Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, Commissioner Andrew Murray is a Rhodes Scholar, a former businessman and a Senator for Western Australia from 1996 to 2008. Commissioner Murray has also chaired and been a member of too many to name community business and political boards, committees and associations. Attending university in South Africa and England, Commissioner Murray holds degrees in English and history, philosophy, politics and economics. Born in England in 1947, Commissioner Murray also brings a lived experience as a care leaver and child migrant. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Murray.
Thank you. That's 70 years of life wrapped up in a couple of sentences. A rich experience, I think. Good afternoon. I'll begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present. I thank Dr. Phillip Hawaiian of Churt Place and Dr. Joanne Evans of Monash University for their invitation to launch today's workshop. And I extend my good wishes to all the workshop's presenters and participants, including the Honourable Simon, if I pronounce that correct, McGurk, WA's Minister for Child Protection, who's speaking later today. I'm one of 6 commissioners appointed to Australia's Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. I often tell people it's the largest Royal Commission in Australia's history, which gives you an idea of the size of the problem. This is our 5th and final year of an extensive inquiry. For those of you not yet across our work, I refer you to our website, our published research and our published reports. Our work is dedicated to addressing harm already done and to significantly reducing the likelihood of harm in institutions in future. That prospect, if fully realised, should be a real benefit to individuals, communities, society and the economy. Over the life of the Royal Commission, many victims and survivors of child abuse in various institutional contexts have told us of the distress, frustration and sometimes real trauma that poor institutional records and record-keeping practices and responses have caused them. Today's workshop builds on the setting of the Record Straight for the Rights of the Child Summit held in Melbourne in May this year. These events and the ongoing work on this initiative in other states and territories aim to give a voice to those who've been affected by past failures of record keeping and to act towards the development and implementation of strategies supporting lifelong rights to the creation, access and control of childhood records. This theme of empowerment of children and of adults abused as children lies at the heart of the work of the Commission. I had a lot to say on the matter of why records are central to identity and justice in the Geoffrey Bolton lecture I gave in Perth in November 2016. That lecture is available on the State Archivist's website. We commissioners will have a lot more to say on the records and information topic in our final report. The Commission has heard from victims and survivors of child sexual abuse in many thousands of private sessions and written accounts. The two together will approach 10,000. And evidence in 57 public hearings, as well as conducting a major research and consultation program. Access to records has been of great importance to the work of the Commission. By the time the Commission concludes in December, we expect to have held more than 8,000 private sessions. Those are one-to-one sessions with survivors and victims, and received more than 1,000 written accounts. We have identified more than 4,000 institutions where the sexual abuse of children has been reported to us as having occurred, and we have referred more than 2,200, in fact the latest figure was 2,252, alleged perpetrators to the police and other authorities. We have so far published 59 research papers. We've produced 5 consultation papers and published more than 400 submissions responding to those papers. In March this year, we held our 57th and final public hearing. A majority of public hearings have been followed by published reports, which are available on the website. Over the course of these hearings, we have sat for more than 440 days and heard from more than 1,200 witnesses. We've served notice for the compulsory production of over 1.2 million documents. We've published our interim report and published final reports and recommendations on redress and civil litigation, working with children checks and criminal justice. These reports are now being considered by governments, and I'm pleased to say a number of state governments have already introduced some of our recommendations. At the end of this year, our final report is to be presented to the 7 Commonwealth and state governments who established our letters patent. It will constitute a sizable number of volumes, rounding out our views and recommendations. Now, records are about people. They can reveal major life events or tiny but telling details. They can hold the clue to health issues and hereditary traits. Records help piece together a life story. Key records are essential to getting on with life. For some, like care leavers, records help fill in the gaps to provide information about their life, which may not form part of their knowledge or memory. Indeed, records can help people understand who they are and where they come from. My own impression is that the importance of identity is underestimated by many in the general community, perhaps because they've never lost it or been disconnected from it. When it comes to identity, the need for meaningful records escalates sharply for the many hundreds of thousands of Australians. Note what I said, many hundreds of thousands of Australians who have been in care and will be in care. They can tell a story about identity, family, birthplace, origin, home, childhood. For many, the absence of family details or of information about their past has been deeply hurtful and preventing them from establishing a strong sense of personal and cultural identity. Many people who've come forward to us are trying to access what I'll refer to as historical records, that is, those created before the 1980s. Record-keeping practices varied considerably and were often ad hoc and unsophisticated. In some cases, we heard that historical institutions did not create records about the children in their care at all. Even when records are in existence, they may be utterly inadequate. Another problem is records being destroyed, sometimes inadvertently, sometimes thoughtlessly, but often in line with institutional policy or records disposal schedules. The creation of accurate records and the exercise of good record-keeping practices by institutions that care for children play a critical role in preventing, identifying and responding to child sexual abuse. Poor record-keeping practices can have serious consequences for victims and survivors trying to get justice, accountability or treatment for the harm done to them. In private sessions, commissioners have been told of institutions claiming ignorance due to the absence of records. In many cases, this allowed institutions to deny that individual children were in their care. And in one case, we heard that an alleged perpetrator claimed he never worked for the institution because it kept no employment records. Difficult to prove. The criminal justice system is often seen as not being effective in responding to child sexual abuse cases. Conviction rates are lower, much lower, compared to other crimes. 3 weeks ago, the Royal Commission released 85 recommendations aimed at reforming the Australian criminal justice system in order to provide a fairer response to victims of institutional child sexual abuse. Although we are focused on child sexual abuse in institutions, these recommendations are likely to improve responses to child sexual abuse in all contexts. Our criminal justice report recommends legislative and policy changes which include reforms to police and prosecution responses, to the evidence of complainants, sentences and appeals, and grooming offences. It also recommends new offences, including failure to report and failure to protect. Child sexual abuse cases are often word against word. They're cases with no eyewitnesses and no medical or scientific evidence. Adult complainants can take decades to disclose their abuse as children, and records are often vital to getting treatment, accountability, redress and justice. Quite often, there are facts as to where a child was at the time in the records, or there were partial disclosures or observations by others at the time. This being so, you can easily see how vital those records are. The battle to improve record keeping for care leavers has been a long one. Thankfully, there have been improvements in the way records are kept. Since the 1980s, many statutes have been enacted across Australia to govern the record-keeping practices of state and non-state institutions. Some of these developments have come about in response to recommendations of major national inquiries, such as the Bringing Them Home, Lost Innocents, and Forgotten Australians reports. Others have developed in line with general reform to child protection and to children's services. Our work, and the work of previous inquiries, has put pressure on institutions and governments to improve record keeping to better protect children in the future. We are aware that institutions and government agencies continue to improve systems and archives, and we do acknowledge ongoing problems such as fees and inconsistent laws and practices, as do they. We have also observed governments finding ways to consider how best to tackle a number of records they hold. We are aware of the ongoing efforts to use technology to digitalise records and improve access. Despite the developments in record-keeping laws and policies in the past few decades, our work has revealed that there are still problems with record-keeping practices in institutions today. Last September, the Commission published the consultation paper, Records and Record-Keeping Practices. We proposed principles for good institutional record-keeping practices and for the establishment of a records advocacy service for victims and survivors seeking access to institutional records. The Commission received more than 40 submissions responding to this paper from a wide range of government and non-government organisations and also from individuals. Their valuable feedback has been carefully reviewed and has informed our forthcoming recommendations regarding records and record keeping. It is our hope, and the hopes of very many others, that improvements to records and record-keeping governance will strengthen child-safe practices and better protect children from future harm. Importantly, it would help those searching for identity and those seeking justice for harm done. The Commission's final report is due to Government by the 15th of December this year and will be released to the public after it is tabled in Parliament. We believe our recommendations will help those in the record-keeping community to develop and implement strategies to strengthen record-keeping governance. Of course, this work will need to be ongoing to keep pace with advancements in technology and the need to balance the competing needs of access and security. Your work, all of your work, continues to be vital, particularly for some of the most vulnerable members of our community. Thank you for letting me open this meeting of yours.
Thank you, Commissioner Murray. This workshop is an important follow-up to the Setting the Record Straight for the Rights of the Child initiative held in early May in Melbourne. It is indeed an essential part of the momentum and community building needed to take on the systemic and enduring record keeping and archiving challenges that the Royal Commission has identified. So it is with great pleasure that we present to you the world premiere of a video summary of the summit.
Most of us who were in care years ago had no idea that a record-keeping system existed.
For me, there was just no timeline, and still, like 66, there's no timeline for where I was in care for 8 years.
Care leaver records are extremely important for care leavers to get a sense of identity, to understand why they were placed into care, to know their correct family name, to know their siblings, to know their parents, and to know who do we belong to.
You have the problem when you're reading your records, basically the first thing that occurs to you, well, it's not me. I don't know who that person is, but there's all these things written.
When so much is taken out of any records, it gives a person a false story, really.
Most records that are very prescriptive, they're not actually personal for children, so that's like if the child, is going to school, that their court orders are being met, and it's very much an administrative filling in the forms for a department or a bureaucracy.
We should receive everything unredacted from records, the good, the bad, the ugly.
A young person has the right to be able to have their life documented so that when they grow up, they can learn who they are, what their experiences are, have photos so they can look back and remember some fun times and some good times.
Without that record keeping being accurate and without them having some say in the records, often it leaves them feeling very disenfranchised, and it really can impact on their sense of self and their sense of identity.
I found that it was often questions like, why did I enter care, and I couldn't get that information. It was all redacted.
The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse has certainly raised a number of issues about the inadequacy, the inconsistency, even the absence of adequate records. And this has created huge problems. We know now a lot about the importance of keeping those records for the future.
There's a great tragedy at the moment across Australia that people, children, adults and even elderly Australians are missing out on a large part of the memory of their own childhood. So things that most Australians would take for granted are having photographs, memories, and for care leavers, often that is denied to them. They just don't have access to the memory of their own lives.
I would like to see all children, young people entering in care having a personal journal, a shared journal, a life book.
Some of the things that we're talking about today are a really good start. Systems that children can have input into and can see their whole record.
Going forward, we can't leave it here. We have to continue the network. We have to continue the discussions. As a group, we're probably quite a powerful group if we wanted to collectively do stuff.
So if we reframe what's happening, it is essentially a political struggle. And so as well as a communique that needs to come out of the summit, I would say a very, very carefully thought out and constructed political strategy needs to lie behind it.
I hope that the outrage that many of us feel in our individual services and states is heard more widely, because the situation with records really is outrageous, the redaction and the lack of access to records at the moment.
Well, since the summit, it's been great to be in the position to hear feedback about the difference that it has made. It's like it has people thinking differently, has people wanting to act differently, and so now it's about harnessing that support and building that momentum.
The Faculty of IT was instrumental in setting the summit up, so I hope what this work will achieve long term is that it will fundamentally change the way that records are kept, and I think there's a real opportunity to do that with advances in technology, and I think we've got a great team within the Faculty of IT who want to work with people outside the university to make that happen.
What's next is we've committed to the idea of a national framework for record keeping. Instead of working in our siloed systems, to actually say how do we create a framework that improves the situation for everybody.
Young people in care at the moment and those young people who have left care, it's not enough to hear their voices. It has to be that their solutions and that their recommendations are taken on board.
We've set a target for 2020 to develop a national framework for record keeping.
But I think the time has come, because in the end, if we're not there at the creation and we're there at the end, there's nowhere for these records to go. And I think the Australian Society of Archivists should be there helping to promote that.
From that, we want the next 10 years to be about implementing that framework, making sure that we make that difference for people who experience childhood out-of-home care, that we have the record keeping and archiving infrastructure that meets their lifelong identity, memory and accountability needs.
So not only was that the world premiere, but we are lucky enough to have a number of stars of the video in the room this afternoon. So if you would like to know more about, from what I have heard and understand was a very powerful experience, please feel free to talk to them during the break. Now, we also know that records are kept in all kinds of ways, and there's many ways to tell a story. So you will see to my left here that we are capturing this afternoon's learning in words and pictures as well. So again, during the break and after the conclusion of today's formal proceedings, invite you to come and have a look and see whether your learning is reflected in some of those words and pictures also. So to set the scene for WA, including an insight into what records and access to records means for care leavers, it is with great delight that I introduce you to Ron Love, Anne McVeigh and Dr Phillip Hawaiian from Tuart Place. Ron Love is an ex-resident of Castledare and Clontarf Boys Homes. He is the editor of Ron's Gazette and the chairperson of Forgotten Australians Coming Together, the governing body of service provider Tuart Place. Anne McVeigh is a former child migrant who was born in the Republic of Ireland and arrived on the shores of Australia at the age of 5. Anne lived at St Joseph's Orphanage from 1950 to 1960 and was a ward of the state until she turned 21. Anne has been a long-term campaigner for recognition and justice for people who were abused in institutional out-of-home care. She too is a board member of Tuart Place. Dr Phillip Hawaiian has been the director of Tuart Place since its inception in 2012. Dr White has operated services for care leavers for the last 12 years and ran the primary support service for the Redress WA scheme from 2008 to 2011. Philippa is passionate about improving the lives of forgotten Australians and ensuring they have full rights to redress and the records about their lives. She believes that it is imperative that care leavers have maximum involvement in the governance and co-production of their own services. Please join me in welcoming Ron, Anne and Pippa.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, Katrina. And thank you all for being here today. My name is Ron Love, and today I have the honour of sharing some of the many reasons why records are so very important to people with lived experience in out-of-home care as a child. While visiting Tuart Place, some forgotten Australians freely gave permission for their personal quotes and statements to be shared with those who might help our situation, including the archivists, record keepers, and other much appreciated supporters here today. Hoping that sharing these truths will help to ensure the safety of future generations. I have 9 of these statements here to share with you today. I'll try to do them all justice as I start with 2 quite emotional statements. The first statement reads, "No definable words exist that express the importance of records well enough." The short but powerful second statement is, "We have been dehumanised." The third statement is about family records and reads, "Without records, we are just property, with no independent identity." And the fourth statement reads, "I have a burning desire to find and know the truth about who my real parents are, how old they really are their names spelled correctly on their birth certificates? If there are birth certificates for them, are they showing the correct date, time and place of birth? Who are my grandparents?" It's common knowledge that names were changed, records and accurate name spelling were hidden, lost and purposely destroyed in some institutions. This fifth statement reads, "Finding there are no records is devastating. Finding false and incorrect records is also devastating." It is noted that birthdays were not celebrated in some institutions. This sixth statement reads, "As a teenager leaving an institution, I was given a to whom it may concern note. This handwritten note indicated my name and a date of birth. Although not a legal document, it was my only identity, the one record of my age, the one record of my existence." More than one person contributed to the seventh and reads, records convey proof of traumatic times and events to parents, siblings and partners who cannot believe the truth of how we have been treated by governments, carers and institutions. The 8th statement describes how one person felt when finding records, and it reads, when my records arrived, they were a mess, just a pile of papers in no particular order, and a lot of it was whited out. I had no idea why that information was taken out, but it was shattering to get records like this. With determination, several people made this 9th and final statement. It reads, we deserve to be recognised. The suffering and trauma we are currently struggling to survive needs to be recognised, recorded, and action taken to prevent all types of abuses to defenceless children in out-of-home care from ever happening again. Thank you for listening to what we have to say today.
My name is Anne McVie, and my search for my records began by accident in 1988 when I ran into a school friend I hadn't seen in years. My friend Margaret had just been released from hospital after a nervous breakdown, which was triggered by reading her child welfare records. Among other things, Margaret had discovered that because of her dark complexion, she had been deemed unsuitable for adoption. Margaret's record contained derogatory comments about her, and she had received no support to deal with the information she received. Margaret and I kept in touch, and because of experiences, she wanted to expose institutional child abuse and help others in the same situation. And with the help of the Child Welfare Department, we started the ICAS support group at the Wish Foundation in Claremont. Margaret helped me get my child welfare record, and in August 1988, I collected them from the Catholic Welfare Office. I had a fair knowledge of my personal history, so there were no surprises, but I was taken aback by how things were presented. There was only a one-page record of my time in care at the age of 5, right through until I turned 21. One of the main things recorded was subsidy rates. No one explained to me what this meant, and I don't know whether my mother had been asked to pay for my upkeep or was it paid for by the welfare department. There were some records of my years of employment when I was sent to work 300 miles away at a farm in Mininu in 1960. But it is only a financial information such as payment of wages, which I didn't receive personally. Nothing recorded about my health or well-being. Also included in my records were 2 child migration documents. The first is a medical report written when I was only 3, recorded under my false name of Lucy, given to me at the National House in Belfast. The second document is the correct document under the name of Anne and was probably used for entering Australia. These records are full of errors, including my place of birth. The records of my childhood in Australia contain no medical records at all. Like many other former child migrants, this has haunted me all my life. For example, I know I had an ear operation when I was living at St. Joseph's, but I have no record of it. This caused problems when I needed an MRI about 5 years ago. I had to explain that I had no medical records because I had been in care as a child, and it meant I had to have tests before an MRI could be done. Medical records and family medical histories are important for everyone, and I hope the situation is better for children in care these days. I also think that every effort should be made to uncover information for forgotten Australians and former child migrants. To this day, some of my schoolmates still not have been able to get any records of their time in care. May I suggest that people receiving their records are provided with information about what various things mean to them, such as subsidy payments, and people reading their records have no way of knowing what these things mean, and many people may not feel confident enough to ask the questions. As a board member of Forgotten Australians Coming Together, I'd like to thank you all for coming here today and for your interest in improving record keeping and access to records for care leavers. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and hello everyone. I want you all to feel a sense of outrage today. Be outraged as I am by what you hear from Ron and Anne, and from those who spent childhoods in out-of-home care and have nothing to show for it. No photos, no medical history, no school records, nothing. While we can't recreate documents that have been destroyed or weren't made in the first place, we can do everything possible to improve access to what still exists, and we can improve the experience of those seeking to find it. We can also make sure that what happened to the stolen generations, forgotten Australians and former child migrants doesn't happen to children and young people in care today. Access to records for WA care leavers changed dramatically about 10 years ago. In 2007, Redress WA was announced, and it led to a flood of records applications, primarily for historic child welfare records. Many people didn't know the dates or places they'd been in care, and they needed this information quickly. The department was swamped with requests, and the waiting list for records soon extended past the redress closing date. Some people had to submit their applications without seeing their records, the same records that were used to assess their claims. Things have never been the same since, and in the years since Redress WA, access to records has become increasingly restricted. Previously, care leavers could apply for a complete copy of their file, but now they must request specific documents. There's an obvious problem here. How do you know what's on your file if you haven't seen it? Release of information staff are very helpful and work around this as much as possible, but the basic problem remains. If you haven't seen your file, you don't know what to ask for. This system isn't used in other states, which have proactive disclosure regimes, such as New South Wales and Queensland. Another change over the last decade has been a steep increase in the amount of information redacted from out-of-home care records. Ironically, the introduction of a Freedom of Information framework seems to have been the catalyst for this. This is clearly an unintended consequence. Previously, personal records requested from the department would have little or no content redacted, and a copy of the whole file would be released. However, FOI requires that third-party information is removed, and this applies to family members as well. Departmental staff try and find ways to ameliorate this, but they're hampered by the current system. Records often arrive very heavily redacted, with not only third-party names obscured, but whole paragraphs and sometimes entire pages redacted. This causes huge distress to the recipients, and it invites conspiracy theories. Records received from some non-government organisations can also arrive heavily redacted, although none of these agencies are actually bound by FOI legislation. As a way forward, we ask the following things of all record holders. Be as proactive and generous as possible in your release of records. Start with an assumption that you'll release everything and work backwards. Only redact information that's reasonably likely to cause harm to a third party. Photos are really precious. Please never pixelate or obscure the faces of people who appear in the images you release to care leavers. Entire photo collections, generously released by some past providers, have been on the internet for years, and the sky is yet to fall. While we recognise that the redaction of some third-party names in records may be necessary, we suggest that all organisations provide, as a minimum, a reason why the information has been redacted and a summary of the redacted material. We also ask record holders to make public statements about how they ensure that redacted information doesn't cause unnecessary distress to people receiving records, and how they're resourcing the task of providing explanations to avoid care leavers feeling that they know what's in my file but I'm not allowed to. The Find and Connect resource has recently agreed to display this information on their website, which is fantastic. Please ask for only one piece of ID. Even this can be difficult for some care leavers to provide. And it's not necessary for applications to be certified by a JP, it just presents another bureaucratic barrier. Allow people to request a copy of their whole file. Even the smallest scrap of information is important when you're piecing together a fractured childhood. And if you're responding to complaints of historic child abuse, please never use the absence of records to justify the denial of a claim or an experience. Clearly, care leavers' records are in a different category to other records held by state government, and FOI as it currently stands can't accommodate this difference. Perhaps FOI isn't the right framework for releasing these records, and perhaps the various FOI Acts need to be changed, and perhaps WA can lead the way in achieving this. In the meantime, because legislation takes time and because most private sectors aren't covered by FOI, I'm increasingly hopeful that together we can find really effective and smart ways to implement the best practice guidelines and ensure we deliver WA care leavers with a compassionate, respectful and complete records access regime. So, let's make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron, Anne and Philippa. It's very powerful to hear your words and the impact of a lack of words and the enduring impact of that absence. And I think it's important to remember that we are talking of records of childhood that I dare say many of us in the room have the absolute privilege of taking for granted. To give us some important insights into the particular meaning and impact of records for Aboriginal people, including the stolen generations, please let me welcome back Marlene Jacamara and introduce to you Jim Morrison. Jim Morrison is a Goring Minang Noongar elder, a traditional custodian of WA's pristine southern coast, who has proudly passed his strong Aboriginal values to following generations of his extended family. He has been a prominent activist, advocate and a leader in pivotal Aboriginal advancement roles over 4 decades, working passionately to address the rights of the stolen generations and their families, and child protection in the tragic mental health and suicide issues in his community, equity and access to culturally safe services in state and Commonwealth governments, overdue prison reforms, Aboriginal employment, education and training, and the protection of young street people and the formation and management of non-government agencies providing services to Aboriginal families and their broader communities. He has recently taken up leadership of Yokai, Healing Our Spirit, the operational umbrella of the WA Stolen Generations Aboriginal Corporation and the Bringing Them Home Committee. Please join me in welcoming Marlene and Jim.
Thanks again. Hello everyone.
Bodyguard.
And this is my bodyguard. Yes, a very important day today. It's a day of truth telling, and that's what we do when we share things. We tell the truth, not half truth, not some of it, all of it. And this story is about all of it. The the records, to me, reveal the awesome power of the state and the amount of control that the state had over the lives of the First Nations peoples, the peoples of our generations, intergenerational trauma. And that's what we suffer even today. As I'm standing here, I'm suffering. I don't want to be a victim, but I still do suffer from the childhood abuses of myself at Wandering Mission, and I will never forget it. What kind of state, if we didn't have the records, denied a woman the right to bring up her own children, to love her own children, and when requested by my grandmother to have my Uncle Tom Jackamara returned to grandfather and grandmother, she was denied by the state. Dreadful time in our history, people. The other thing that happened was my father's mother was, when my father got taken away and sent to Moore River Native Settlement, she asked to return to her country up in the Upper Gascoyne district, just out of Carnarvon, and she was denied 3 times. So it wasn't only Christ that was denied, our own people were denied. And the awfulness and the personal experience is that the state allowed me to get married at 16 years old. Awful. And I find, and I share these things because they're sacred to me. And when I first started to get the records from DCP, I couldn't really get them because the Freedom of Information Act prohibited and took away a lot of the information. Some of it I couldn't access and wasn't able to access for many years later. And today I have still gaps in the history of my people. And my beautiful mother, what a beautiful champion she was, and so is my father. They were great people, very human, warm, loving, honourable people, and they were cast away at this Moore River Native Settlement. It's a disgrace on our nation, and it's a disgrace, and I think, as Phillip has said, we should all be outraged about the information that we get. Sometimes the secular organisations are the worst because they had such a lot of power over these little people, over these little children. The way that they now seek to put together their own lives and to put together something substantial and tangible for themselves, they are unable to do it because the over-regulation by some of the secular bodies, organisations acting in the name of Christianity hasn't and doesn't allow it to happen. One of the great things for us, though, is that the files from DCP were given to the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, and it was a huge amount of files shifted over to the department, which is now defunct, of course. So we'll see how that works. And I hope, and it's my dearest wish, that that these files are made much more easily accessible to when I first started searching for my own family history. I'm nearly 72 years old now, and I'm still finding things from my childhood that impact on me spiritually, emotionally, and in lots and lots of ways, I think that the people here who have the responsibility to change things should change things for the better, not the worse. And the other personal point of view that I have is that I don't think that the organisation should be given people's personal files, because then it becomes a shift in power. It becomes a shift from the state to the organisational power of people running the organisations. And I believe this information should not be given without the written permission of the person or persons, without their consent. And there is also, I find, there's an ethical and moral responsibility in making the records available to the people. And thank you, Anne, for sharing your story. I was very touched by that. And and I think that the more stories that we share and tell each other, the better. Because some of these files hold very personal information. I was fortunate enough, really, to have a look at my own file, and I was looking at this thing, and I thought, this is about me. This is my story. This is what happened to me. This is how my parents were hounded when they tried to find out who my father was, and the awfulness of being tracked down and hounded like that. Torches shone in people's faces, in their bedrooms, in their beds, and they want to know who the half-caste child was. They want to know, who was it, and where did we come from? And that's why I say, and I still say it, and I'll say it till the day I die, that the state has a huge debt to pay. It has a huge responsibility to its citizens of Western Australia, and certainly the federal government certainly has the responsibility. And the recommendations that I've suggested is that there be some kind of monitoring of the records and access to records made easy as possible, to save it and not become over-regulated. And more resources are needed for the administration and application of the release of files. I say this because of the huge transfer of public files from DCP to the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. And I want to acknowledge the people in the Family and Social History section of the Department of Aboriginal Affairs, especially Mark Chambers. What a champion that man is. And to Anna White and to her team. And I just want to share just a little bit of story about myself. I went back home to my country in the Upper Gascoyne. Sorry, Jim, I'm running out of time. Sorry, but but yeah, and I'll just read some of it because it's easier for me to do it. My return to country was one of the greatest experiences in my adult life. I've not been able to return to country for approximately 61 years. I was left there left there as a child and remembered my father, Mick Dalgetty, working on the stations, and my child memory takes me to a place in my childhood that was a good place. I remembered going on the mail truck to the stations and outstations where my dad worked, and I stayed with him until I was 8, until I was sent to Wandering Mission. I was brought up by German nuns and priests. I learned about Aboriginal culture and people from my university studies. Shameful, but I did it. I was very fortunate to have good memories of my family. My dad and Granny, and my dear grandmother, Granny Dolly. And I'm so proud of them because they were such beautiful, fine, dignified people. And I want to be like them, I want to follow in their footsteps. I want to say what it was like for me to return to country, to return to my homeland. And I did that a few years ago. And to this day, I'm forever grateful that I went back and I met my people again in 1977. My dear old grandmother, Granny Dolly, she died when she was well over 100 years old. And I was talking to my cousin actually this morning, and I said, I haven't, this is what I missed. I missed out on all of these stories. I missed out on all the landmarks. I missed out on the history. And I've missed out on lots and lots of things away from my own land and country, in my homelands, really. And the language. And my cousin said to me this morning, she said, "Oh, are you with us now?" And I burst out crying. So, but it's such a personal journey. The files, I cried many times. And I'll just share this last little bit before I hand over to Jim. Was in those files, there was the order for my clothes when I was just born. And I thought, this is my mother's handwriting at the age of 17, asking the state for clothes for myself. Sometimes I didn't get it. The other one was when my father worked at one of the stations in Three Springs. He wanted a gramophone, and the woman there said no, he couldn't have it, because he had to apply to have a gramophone. And the other one was my dear grandmother, my mother's mother, said, she wanted to have her child back from Carolup Mission. And the state said no. So the state and governments and people have a responsibility to set this right and to say enough is enough. Anyway, that's me. And thank you for listening, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to share part of my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. Yokai! That is the Noongar war cry. I am outraged in what I hear today. Thank you, Philippa, for reminding how outraged we should be. Yokai is the Noongar war cry. Enough is enough. Healing our spirit is about healing our people who have been taken from culture, who can't speak their language, can't practice their culture. I represent my 30 parents. Yes, Dad was the oldest of 23, and Mum was one of 7, all removed and put into concentration camps. Dad fought for this country before he was a citizen on the Changi prison, I should say, tortured before he was a citizen. Whilst his brothers were away, our children were taken. So yokai for us is healing our spirit, giving us back our culture, what we were taken from us. Acknowledging country, that's great for our people to say that if they were born on this country. So I'll acknowledge the Whadjuk people, and I acknowledge those people who speak language and are strong in their spirit because of their culture. For us, it's a way forward. We've, in the just the last little while, have taken over A.O. Neville's office. Who was A.O. Neville? Well, he influenced Adolf Hitler. Breed out the colour. My mother was allowed to marry my mother because she was fairer in skin. Breed out the colour was about our removal. It was genocide. In the first generation of colonisation, our men and boys were killed. In our second generation of colonisation, our women were raped. In our third generation of colonisation, our children were taken. This is our history. This is the truth. Yokai is truth, justice and healing. Let us have our records so we know the truth. Let us have our justice that our Royal Commissioner spoke about. Let us have our healing. Let us have our cultural healing. Reconciliation won't happen unless we have truth, justice and healing. I wanted to show you a video, but I've probably run out of time. Ooh. This is what we're all about. Can I just do this now? Can I just say one last thing before this 2-minute video, which expresses what we're all about? It's not oranges and lemons. Oop, can you stop there? I think there was a movie, Oranges and Sunshine, wasn't there? I watched that movie and I thought, those people could have been black. It's the same story. The synergies are here. Why are we doing this separately? Our people, sadly, are not empowered like yours. And I know there's been some outrage, but we need to join forces. This is so powerful that we can do this together. And I recognise that in the past there have been some issues between forgotten Australians and stolen generation peoples, but please, let's work together. This is a disgrace. This is an outrage. So I'll just... We're getting there. So thank you for your attention. I really acknowledge your trauma, your pain, along with my 30 parents, and the pain that stolen generations have experienced as well. So I'll leave with this small video. Where'd my sister go? Okay. Thank you.
Complex societies. In 1788, when tall ships came, everything changed. The British invasion disregarded the original inhabitants of children, especially those of mixed race, who were forcibly removed from their mother here with us. It's time to regain control of our own life.
Marlene and Jim, thank you so much for sharing your personal and political stories, your passion and very much your outrage. We turn our attention now to record-keeping practices for today's children and young people in out-of-home care. And it's my honour to introduce to you 3 speakers from CREATE. CREATE is the peak body that represents children and young people with a care experience. CREATE's vision is to create a better life for children and young people in care. They run events, workshops and consultations across Australia with the aim of connecting children and young people to each other, to CREATE and to their community. And with this connection, they empower children and young people to build their self-confidence, self-esteem and skills that enable them to have a voice, to be heard and to make a positive change to the care system through advocacy and increased community awareness. In short, CREATE are passionate about getting the voices of young people heard, and children and young people are at the heart of everything that CREATE does. We are delighted that 2 of CREATE's young consultants, Lily and Andre, are here today to share their thoughts and experiences on how young people with a care experience can access their case files and records to improve this for young people into the future. Young consultants are young people with a care experience who have completed CREATE's leadership training, Speak Up. There are 3 levels to the training, and both the young consultants who are going to join us today have completed all 3 levels. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Ellie, to introduce Create and the young consultants. Ellie is one of the community facilitators at Create, and she facilitates a number of their programs and events. And if you would like to sign a young person up to Create or find out more about any of their programs, please feel free to chat to Ellie in what we keep calling a break, but is actually an opportunity for you to do all sorts of things. So thank you, Ellie.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having us today. My name's Ellie. As Katrina said, I'm one of the community facilitators at Create. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners, the Whadjuk Noongar people whose land we meet on today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. As Katrina mentioned, Create is the peak body that represents children and young people with a care experience. Our mission is to create a better life for children and young people in care, and we're really excited that Lily and Andre are here today to share some of their experiences. We're also really excited to be part of this workshop today, as accessing records and how records are documented is an issue that young people have regularly raised with us. Last year, in 2016, accessing case files was one of the top 4 issues that young people wanted to focus on. Issues that young people consistently spoke about include how challenging they found it to access their files, both before leaving care and post leaving care. Young people also had really different experiences about accessing their files, with some young people being told they need to pay per sheet, whereas others there was no cost. Young people also talked about the lack of emotional support linked to accessing their case files, and how they wanted more conversations about their history. Like, a file can be good, but sometimes a conversation with a human is much better, although having both is really the best option. So building on this, over the past 18 months, a group of our young consultants have been working with the department in a working group and working alongside the department to try and make this process easier for young people. So you'll be able to see on the back wall there, our young consultants have just created a flowchart and a list of FAQs for young people around how to access their files, both while they're in care and leaving care. So we're really excited to have that, and please do have a look at it and ask us anything you might have about it. I'm not going to steal everything that Lily and Andre want to say today. So I just want to give you a little bit more information about our young consultants before I invite them up to speak. So Andre is 21, and since becoming a young consultant in January of last year, has been an amazing advocate for young people with an out-of-home care experience, and has been involved in all aspects of Create's work. Some fun and interesting facts about Andre are that he is a chef, gamer, aspiring actor, and self-confessed geek. And one day he hopes to open up his own restaurant and become a well-known actor. But first he's going to have to take out his competition, who are Gordon Ramsay and Hugh Jackman. And I'd also like to introduce to you Lily. Lily's 19 and passionate about improving opportunities for young people in out-of-home care. Having grown up in out-of-home care herself, Lily has overcome significant challenges in her own life to become the outspoken, amazing advocate for others that you'll see her today. Lily has volunteered as a young consultant with Create Foundation for over 2 years. 3 years. 4 years. Almost been 4 years. Need to update my info on Lily. It's nearly 4 years. And a couple of fun facts about Lily. Her favourite animal is a pig. And she was chased by these are old ones. These are old ones. So she was chased by an emu when she volunteered at Native Animal Rescue. And she has also recently been working on one of a children's camp where she got covered head to toe in paint and glitter. You can find more about that in the break if you want to. And both our young consultants have been involved with working alongside the department to improve access to case files for children and young people. And we're really delighted to have them here today to share their wisdom and knowledge. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Andre up to speak.
How's everyone going today? Oh, yay, interaction, yay. Before I start, I always ask this question whenever I do a speech. Anyone here a Doctor Who fan? A couple over there, one over there. Anyone over there? Sweet, awesome. No, that puts me at ease. So throughout our lives, we're always asking questions. From a young age, why is the sky blue? Or my personal favourite, are we there yet? So my mum died when I was 4 years old. I then lived with my auntie and uncle until I was about 14. At 14, I was given a choice by my auntie. You can come work with us today and you get to live with us. Or the second, don't. Pack your bags and leave. In 5 seconds, I made my decision. And I had my bag packed and was out the door running to my girlfriend's place. I was there for the weekend and then started school, and then before I knew it, I was in care. During my time in care, I was in 3 foster homes, 3 group homes, 2 semi-independent places, 1 share house, and then my friend's place. I then experienced 6 months of homelessness, and then picked myself up, found crisis accommodation, moved into Foyer Oxford in Leederville. I now have my own place, and in a couple of months I'm moving in with my girlfriend. Throughout this time, though, I never really understood why I was given a choice. I never understood why I was in care. I asked my psychologist how I could find out. He said it would be documented in the affidavit. I had no idea what that was, so I asked. And apparently it's the who, what, when, why, and where, and people's documentations of what happened. So I went to the department asking to see if I can see the affidavit. I was told straight up, no. Why? You're too young. I was 17. So I went back to my psychologist and told them exactly what they said to me. And he's like, no, that's not good enough. You are ready for this. He writes them a letter, sends it back to them, and their response is, we need to get one of our psychologists to do an evaluation on you. We need another psychologist to do an evaluation on you, even though we've just got an evaluation from a psychologist that we're paying. I was angered. All I wanted to do was look at some paperwork. So I called the Advocate for Children and Young People in Care. I called her and we talked for a couple of hours, and in 2 months, it took 2 months, I finally got to see the affidavit with no redactments because no one's names were mentioned. And I was able to say why I was put into care. Brain just went dead. It was a very hard time for me to find out what it was, because to me at that point it was just paperwork. It was just a piece of paper with writing on it. I didn't know how much what it was gonna teach me, what I was gonna learn from it. But I feel like when we ask for information, people go, oh, they're not ready for it. It's not time for them to know. We know when we're ready for it. We're asking when we are ready. And I feel like it would be amazing if everyone could take that into account. Thanks.
Oh, that's right. I apologise. I'm nowhere near as funny as Andre. So good afternoon. My name is Lily and I am 19 years old. I was under the care of the department for 12 years, since the age of 6. I currently work at Southlake Community Centre. In the future, I hope to be a mental health support worker and should be continuing studies next year. I will try and keep this short and sweet, but I still hope you take something away. So I have trouble standing still. But my care experience was not horrible, but it wasn't joyous either. There were days where I didn't know whether I would sleep or if I would even eat. In saying that, I did still have some amazing placements in which I can look back on and forever be thankful for the time I spent there and the people that helped guide me in the right direction. It may have been a bumpy road, but I can stand here before you and say, I made it. When it comes to the leaving care process, there was already so much going on without the daunting process of trying to get our case files. When I first tried to access my records, I didn't even know where to start. After speaking with my caseworker and team leader, I was told I had to ask for a specific thing or time or event. For example, the affidavit, which when I did get had no redactments. I saw everybody's name, I saw all the dates, I saw everything. So if in that occasion I could see everything, why is no one else seeing everything? But even though I read it, it just raised more questions. I'd already been told why I was in care, but it didn't line up with what it didn't line up with what was in front of me. I wanted the answers, but I wanted them all at once. Everyone I had asked had a different answer on what the process was. It got so confusing and overwhelming, I've given up. After speaking with other young people who had gone through the process or who were attempting to get their files, they said they had similar experiences, but also very different in some aspects. Some people had to pay prices ranging from 20 cents a page to 50 cents, while others didn't pay anything. Some were told to cut questions out because it would not have been done in the 45-day turnover. Other struggles that I have heard are that there was no support when trying to access the files. I feel like everyone, no matter what their age, should receive support through this process. Counselling, whatever. Trying to narrow down questions to ask when you want the whole thing or you don't even know what to ask for. Because you don't know, I don't even know where I read that from. See, I am funny. Trying to narrow down questions to ask when you want the whole thing because you know if you received it in sections, it's going to cause more stress and more questions. I've also heard that young people have read their files and there's lots of parts missing, or what is written is not what is remembered as true. Both of these just raise more questions, more confusing, and it's just a circle going around and around. Over the past year, Create Foundation has formed a working group to combat major issues young people have identified, and Case Files is one of the ones we've been working on. After many discussions and planning, we have come up with a very simple flowchart and everyone, even people at the department, can easily follow. Even though we have come up with this, there are a few other suggestions I would like to make. Have a clear and concise place where we apply for our files. Have you guys ever been on the Freedom of Information website? We should be able to keep the files, as I've been told I wasn't allowed to keep anything, but I'm hearing different again. But we should be able to keep all files as well as have paid access to a counsellor, because what's in those files will most likely be traumatic and bring up a lot of unresolved feelings. In conclusion, I would like to see the process made simpler for everyone and the issues I have said be brought to attention in the hope they are changed. One last thing is my favourite quote is, we all want to see change, but we might have to change within ourselves to see it. Thank you.
Thank you, Andre, Lily and Ellie. And a reminder that what we are talking about today are not just historical issues, but they are indeed ongoing and enduring human rights. So we have been talking to you or at you for quite some time now, and as a social worker, I much prefer talking with people. Also, as a social worker, one of the early concepts I was introduced to was the idea that we work through our head, our heart and our hands. So I'm going to invite you now to talk with the people at your table about what has struck your heart today, what has informed your thinking, your head, and what it is that your hands are going to change and going to do going forward. So I invite you to talk to one another. We will be welcoming the Minister Simone McGurk at around about 2:30, we think. So we'll stop you talking at that point to hand over to her. But yes, please. invite you to hold on to your thoughts and your feelings and your actions for this afternoon's interactive workshop. We certainly will be drawing on those this afternoon as we start to identify an agenda for going forward. I would like now to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Simone McGurk. Simone is the Minister for Child Protection, Women's Interests, the Prevention of Family and Domestic Violence and Community Services. She's the State Labor Member for Fremantle. As a Minister in the McGowan Labor Government, Simone is working to build strong, resilient communities for children and families. It is our honour, therefore, to welcome Simone this afternoon as our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much. A fantastic turnout here today. So welcome to Fremantle, my electorate, and also where I live. It's a beautiful place. And can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we're meeting today, the Whadjuk Noongar people. Often we give that acknowledgement and we say pay our respects, but if we really stop and think about that, it is about building respectful relationships, not in thinking about how people were treated in the past, but actually how we interact today and in the future. And I think part of building respectful relationships with Aboriginal people is to acknowledge the importance for them of their connection to family, community, their culture, and also to their country. So that's an important acknowledgement for us. I'd also like to acknowledge all of you who are in the room today who have had an experience with the out-of-home care system. For you to come along here and to hear what we as a state government are doing with people who are impacted by the out-of-home care system is important, but also to add your experiences is something that must take a bit of bravery and courage, and I'd really like to acknowledge that. I'd also like to acknowledge the WA Auditor General, who's here in the background. I see him. Thanks very much. I think we had one of the Royal Commissioners here today, Andrew Murray. We've got the WA Information Commissioner, the Public Advocate and the State Archivist also here today, all important people for making sure that we've got good systems in place to do what we have to do to keep children safe, but in the process of doing that, to provide them with the best supports possible. I just thought I'd go over a few things today in terms of briefly go over what's happening with children in the child protection system and what we're dealing with in present terms. A little bit briefly about reforms that we're looking at in terms of children who are impacted by the child protection system in WA, and then finally the issues about record management. So I'll just talk briefly about the 2015-16 figures. So in terms of what is now the Department of Communities, previously Child Protection and Family Support, there were over 104,000 contacts made to the department in relation to child protection. Just over 19,000 child protection notifications were recorded, relating to just over 18,000 children at risk of abuse and harm. So 104,000 contacts, just over 19,000 notifications, and that affected just over 18,000 children. In the end, 13,500 safety and wellbeing assessments were commenced, and just over 4,000 of those safety and wellbeing assessments were substantiated. So just over 4,000. And as a result of those assessments, 931 children were taken into a care. So we're just talking about 1 year, 2015-16. So I suppose the point about those figures is that you get the big headline figures in terms of the number of contacts that are made to the department, over 104,000. Then the notifications, how many children that impacted, how many safety and wellbeing assessments were made, just over 4,000, and as a result of that, 931 children taken into care. There are, in that same year, just over 124,000 working with children checks were conducted. 124,000. So you really start to see the scale of the number of notifications and then coming down. Still a lot of children being taken into care, but a number of reports that in the end were not substantiated. In that year, 2015-16, we had 4,658 children in out-of-home care, so just over 4,600 children in out-of-home care, and 53% of those were Aboriginal. A really high number of children impacted by the out-of-home care system are Aboriginal compared to the general population, which is about 3,000 of overall Aboriginal people in WA, and I think about just over 16% of children are Aboriginal, yet 53% of our children in the child protection system are Aboriginal. Unfortunately, though, in reeling out those figures, we know that they don't really cut through at communicating the complexity of each of those numbers that I just spoke about, each of the people that are represented, particularly when you're talking about the children in out-of-home care. The Commissioner for Children and Young People's report, speaking out and raising concerns in care, quoted a 12-year-old in his report, and he quoted a 12-year-old girl saying, "I wanted to see my dad and the caseworker called him, and now they tell me they had actually forgotten to call him." So the caseworker had told the 12-year-old that they were going to call her father, but actually they forgot to make that call. The girl says, "I don't even know my family on my dad's side. I don't even know what my background is. I want to know why my dad doesn't want to have any contact with me. If he really did want to have contact with me, perhaps he could have called DCP." So that story shows just how important it is to realise when someone says they're going to do something to actually do it, but also to understand the enormity of what that sort of communication and those sort of links that are made between the department and people's family, and the people in care, children in care's family, and understanding what that means in practice. Sadly, the sentiment is often conveyed to me in the 6 months since I've been sworn in as Minister, the feelings of isolation, uncertainty and doubt in the family members that are impacted by children in out-of-home care, but also the children themselves. As many of you know too well, these feelings can remain long after a person leaves the care of the state. So how is our government responding to these issues? We've taken a few important steps by continuing the reform that was started by the previous government. If we think that reform was sound, we're not going to undo that work just because we've changed government. And actually, I think in terms of child protection, there were some changes happening within the department that seemed that were a long time coming. So just as I said, because we've changed government, we don't intend to undo that work, and I'll just address those briefly. Now called the Department of Communities, so people might be aware that the Department of Child Protection and Family Support, previously the Housing Authority, Disability Services and Communities have come together to form one department called the Department of Communities. And that department will also include parts of the juvenile justice system. So previously, the Child Protection and Family Support were doing significant reforms in terms of the out-of-care system. So that is all the children that are taken into the care of the state. So first of all, we know that children are coming into care earlier, they're staying longer in care, and we know that their needs are more complex. As I said, we also know that there's a significant overrepresentation of Aboriginal children in the out-of-home care system. We know that there are more family carers than any other type of carer. We know that there is an unsustainable costing of the system and funding into the system. So this is a very expensive system to run, and it's likely just to become more expensive, so we need to keep an eye on that. The current non-government funding model was ad hoc in its allocation, and then we've got external factors such as the Royal Commission into child sex abuse, into the institutional responses to child sex abuse. So in terms of out-of-home care reform, there was a report done internally within the department, and that resulted in 72 recommendations that are currently now being implemented through the department. The first, and I'll just briefly talk about those. So first of all, the aim of the reform was to ensure that the child is at the centre of all case practice decisions. So the child is at the centre of a decision. The aim also is to strengthen the legislative framework to support the best outcomes for children, so to make sure we've got robust legislation that actually ensures that the children are at the centre of decisions. We want to better align services and funding agreements. That's not always been the case in the past. Sometimes the way the department has run itself and its contracts with the community sector was described to me as a kind of house that Jack built. So bits have been added over time and it wasn't necessarily looked at in a holistic way. We needed to make sure the foster care system is the best that it could be, and any improvements that needed to take place did take place. Better analyse how the needs of children in care are assessed and costed, and to increase the focus on measuring and reporting outcomes. Now, this sounds a little bureaucratic, but I think it's an important change. That what we've seen too much in government procurement and in the community sector is that we talk about contracting to do some activities rather than the outcomes that it achieves. And that's a fundamental shift that I think that we've committed to do, to undertake in the state government sector, that we try and really understand what are the outcomes that we want for those children and for their lives, and how do we then describe our contracts to drive activity towards that, as I said, rather than just inputs or activities undertaken by those providers. So that's been an important part of the changes. So that's been an important part of change that's been undertaken, is really having a look at the out-of-home care, the systems around children going into care, and whether we are properly geared in everything we do to get the best outcome for those children. Another part of the reform was called the Early Intervention and Family Support Strategy. And the idea about this is that we need to start redirecting resources when families begin to show signs of stress, so that we can support those families before children are then impacted so severely that they need to be taken into out-of-home care. So that's the idea about early intervention, and also to make sure that we make good use of data and understanding when we undertake those interventions, that we're using that data to assess whether those interventions have been successful or not. And in fact, there's been quite a bit of work already commenced to work with the Department of Treasury so that they are brought along in the journey to understand the importance of financial investment in early intervention, and then to properly track, as I said, not only those interventions to see whether they're successful, but also to actually improve the important buy-in of that early intervention work. Because not only is it important, obviously, for better outcomes for those families, if we can keep families together and functioning in a happy, healthy way, then it's good for those families and obviously good for children, but essentially it's cheaper on the public purse. It's cheaper than children then getting into the out-of-home care system. It's cheaper than eventually some of those children ending up in the justice system and the like. So how do we make sure that there's a really, embedded in government, there's a very deep understanding of the importance of early intervention work. So that work has already commenced, and you might hear that called in departmental terms sometimes as the IFE strategy, so early intervention family support. It also includes Aboriginal in-home support services, a strategy to strengthen the relationships with Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. So actually to understand the people that are best able to work with families in their own communities, and with Aboriginal families, the best people that are able to work with them in an effective way will be Aboriginal organisations, but we've got to support those organisations building their capacity. As I said, that also should be informed by good outcomes framework. So we really understand what those interventions are and what do we hope to achieve, and are we achieving that? There's some work being done in Kalgoorlie and Kununurra around the early intervention and family support services. So it can sound bureaucratic, but when we're talking about the number of children in out-of-home care and the number of people in the department and the amount of work that's done at the tertiary end, at the end when things are that bad that children are taken into the out-of-home care system, recalibrating that and trying to bring some of that into the early intervention and then tracking how we're going in relation to that actually takes quite a bit of work if it's going to be quality work and if it's going to be sophisticated work. And as I said, I commend people within the department who have started that recalibration. And in fact, for us as under the McGowan team that went to the election, we also took a policy called Target 120, which was an early intervention strategy to stop juveniles ending up in the correction system. The idea being that if we concentrate on those families and those children who are at risk of going into the correction system, into the juvenile justice and then the adult correction system, if we do that effectively, we can hold them back. Obviously good for them and their families, but also much more cost effective as a public policy. So the idea about early intervention is a really central one, but one that requires, as I said, quite a sophisticated approach if we want to be effective. There's also a review of the Community and Children and Community Services Act, so the current act that governs out-of-home care system and the child protection system in WA is required every 5 years to undertake we're required to undertake a review of that act. And so the public submissions for that review have finished now, and we're having a look at how all of that review then we make sure that the Act reflects those priorities that I've just spoken about making sure that our out-of-home care system is geared towards the child, the systems are as robust as they can be, both in government terms but also in the community sector, and also that we have resources directed at early intervention. In terms of the work that the department's doing and as a government agency working not only within its own significant number of staff, I think there's about 2,500 staff that work in the child protection element of communities, but we've got a large number of not-for-profit sectors working, people in the not-for-profit sector working as well and doing some very important work. I think we understand that reform in itself is not going to solve everything all at once. It is an ongoing work, and I think if the Royal Commission has taught us anything, it is that these are not just historical cases that we need to worry about. We need to keep in front of mind what are our child safety concerns now in our community alive at the moment, and the revelations that have come from Operation Fledermaus in the West Pilbara bring that to mind all too acutely, and people might be aware that there have now been 31 or 32 people charged with child sex offences, something like 300 charges, and over 150 children impacted by that particular operation, which hasn't finished. You might have seen reports, but I was in the Pilbara last week and I went to Roebourne to speak to the child protection workers, and then speaking to them, trying to get a handle on whether we are doing everything we can to ensure that those children impacted are supported and safe, those children potentially impacted are supportive and safe, but also to understand the complexity of those sort of numbers in a number of communities. It's not just one town, it is actually a number of communities and towns in the West Pilbara. And I also had an opportunity to speak to some of the women elders when I was there, and they started off the conversation saying, well, you're the sixth minister to come and see us and ask us what we think needs to be done. So we'd really appreciate it if you could listen to us and actually act on what we say, rather than just coming to ask us what we think and then not do anything. So I certainly feel that responsibility very heavily, that at the beginning of a 4-year term, as a government, we have an opportunity to embark on a process hand in hand with that community to make sure that we're doing everything we can to keep those children safe, to keep community members safe. There's adults as well that are at risk of a disproportionately high culture of violence and particularly family violence. But also that we understand we need to keep children safe, that we do a lot better at bringing services together, and the government departments and all the different agencies, federal, state, local and the not-for-profit sector, in coming together and working together in a much more integrated and effective way. We really do need to improve that. But finally, we work with the community itself towards a celebration, a healthy celebration of Aboriginal culture, and to understand the hurt and the trauma that's occurred in those communities in the past, and how we can give expression to healing and recovery, hand in hand with Aboriginal leadership in that community and other communities affected. That absolutely has to occur over the long term. It's not something that's going to happen in 6 months or 1 year. It has to be a process that we learn from and we continue to work from. And that, I think, I certainly feel, as I said, the weight of that responsibility very strongly, and want to be held to account in my time as Minister for my ability to influence that work in areas affected, such as the West Pilbara. People here, I could talk about the Royal Commission, but I suspect that people here are very aware of the work of the Royal Commission in terms of its remit, the breadth of the work that it's done, how many, nearly 40,000 calls handled, over 23,000 letters or emails received, nearly 7,000 private sessions held. I mean, they really have operated at a significant scale, and I want to commend, first of all, the government leadership at the time. And Julia Gillard was Prime Minister when that was set up, and it really was an important step, I think, in acknowledging, not only uncovering what's occurred, but acknowledging for those people who were impacted that these issues would be brought into the open. And so we've had a number of different reports, as I think people here would know: the interim report, working with Children Checks report, redress and civil litigation, criminal justice report, individual case studies and research projects that have also taken place. In the state government in WA, since the establishment of the Royal Commission, the Department of Premier and Cabinet, so this is a department that operates in the state government, and its job is to try and coordinate matters that need good cooperation and coordination across government departments. It has had responsibility for coordinating WA's input into the Royal Commission, and also having a close look at, alongside the State Solicitor's Office, of providing a single point of contact for the Royal Commission. As I said, coordinating their responses to information requests in terms of what's needed from the WA government. Coordinating and preparing the state government responses to those issues. So what does the WA government think of those issues that are coming up in the Royal Commission? And also supporting people who have government representatives' appearance at public hearings and the like. And certainly as the Minister responsible for child protection and communities, as well as women's interests, I know, and I know other members of the Cabinet take very seriously the messages that are coming from the Royal Commission and that were expected to be finalised in December. So making sure that there's a comprehensive response from our government is something that we take very, very seriously, and some of that work commenced before we came to office, as I said. But I think it's, we can't say that we weren't warned in terms of the number of issues that are coming up. So then I come to record keeping and what this means for us as a state government and for the people that we represent through the width and breadth of the state. The issues raised in the Royal Commission relating to records have included poor institutional records and record keeping practices, including records either never created or containing only limited, inaccurate or insensitive content. There have also been instances of records being lost or destroyed and limited support and difficulties in accessing records. And the impacts of this on people affected are very real, and people have spoken at the Royal Commission that this has meant for them a disconnection with family and community, a lack of knowledge or personal and family medical histories, a loss of ethnicity, language and culture, a loss of a feeling of a recollection of childhood experiences and memories, a sort of quantification or a documentation of those. It's meant diminished self-esteem and sense of identity for people. It's meant that they were prevented from identifying risks and incidents of child sexual abuse. It's delayed or obstructed responses to those risks and allegations to either those risks or allegations and instances of child sex abuse. So it's meant that we weren't able to effectively respond where there have been those concerns. It's also meant it has obscured the extent of institutional knowledge of abuse. So it clouds all the issues and our understanding of exactly what has occurred as a government and across departments to understand how we can improve. It's also hindered disciplinary action, redress efforts and civil and criminal proceedings. So on so many fronts, it has been the impact of those poor, lax or non-existent methodologies in record keeping have had a knock-on effect for people. The Royal Commission released its Records and Record Keeping Practices consultation paper in 2016 to examine the records and record keeping practices of both older and contemporary institutions to identify primary areas of concern. It also considered whether a records advocacy service would be useful for victims and survivors, and it proposed and seek feedback on 5 high-level principles to improve institutional record-keeping practices. And I don't know whether you've been through these already today, some of these points that were brought up in the Royal Commission. But the principles, 5 high-level principles to improve institutional record-keeping include creating and keeping accurate records in the best interests of the child. That should be the criteria, in the best interests of the child. Accurate records must be created about all decisions and incidents affecting child protection. Records relevant to child sexual abuse must be appropriately maintained in an indexed, logical and secure manner with associated records cross-referenced to ensure that persons using these records are aware of all relevant information. Records relevant to child sexual abuse must only be disposed of subject to law or policy. And 5, individuals' right to access and amend records about them can only be restricted in accordance with the law. So we're very clear and upfront to, if there needs to be changes to legislation, that those debates occur in the public arena in the Parliament, and then that the legislation is adhered to in relation to any any restrictions or changes to those records. In summary, we agree that record keeping and archiving should be part of a system that protects children from abuse and neglect and promotes their interests and well-being. These systems in themselves should not cause harm. As a government, we support the 5 principles that I've just outlined, the 5 principles proposed by the Royal Commission in its consultation paper. There is strong alignment between existing state records and record-keeping standards and current record-keeping policies and practice guidance in the proposed principles. So we believe that there are the elements there for us to adhere to those principles in WA state government practices. And finally, we need to discuss how to further enhance the way records for childhood out-of-home care are created, captured, managed, archived and addressed to meeting lifelong identity, memory and accountability needs. And this really goes to the point of why we do all this. One is so that the state is accountable, so those agents that were involved in children impacted by out-of-home care have accurate records so they can go back and access them for the reasons that I've outlined. But really it goes to that central point of making sure that the child is at the centre of our decision making and our policy making. And that adjustment and the integrity of our information towards that end is, I think, non-negotiable. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Minister McGurk, for giving us a picture of the McGowan Labor government's commitment to reform in the out-of-home care system and, really importantly, early intervention to prevent entry into the out-of-home care system. And I think so crucially putting children at the very centre and the very heart of not only decisions but legislation, service delivery and what we're here talking about today, records. And what we've heard today, particularly from people who have had an experience of being in out-of-home care, reminds us that that experience is one that has a lifelong meaning and a lifelong impact, and not only the importance of, but the very rights to their access to records for understanding that experience. So that brings the first part of our afternoon to a close, and I'd just like to once again thank all of our speakers. You've given us much to think about as we head into this afternoon's workshop session about practices in both access to records for past care leavers and learning from those past experiences about how we can improve not only the creation of records but access to those records for children and young people in our care today. So we would now like to invite you to enjoy afternoon tea, and we will reconvene for the workshop at 3:30. The bell will call you back. Thank you.
Before I forget to, yes.
So one way to begin clearing a room is to tell people that after afternoon tea they're going to be part of an interactive workshop. So thank you very much for staying. But to settle you back in, we are going to introduce you, albeit virtually, to Dr. Debbie Rosa. So Dr. Rosa may be known to many of you in the room today. She worked with Josette Mars developing the first West Australian finding aid for people looking for records from Catholic homes in 1997. And she has since gone on to develop some of the most significant finding aids for government, including signposts and roads for records of adoption. When Redress WA started, Debbie worked with CBIR's Redress Services to help people make applications to the Redress WA scheme. So she is not only a go-to person for finding records, she has first-hand experiences of people's responses to receiving information about their past. Debbie was also the state-based historian for the Find and Connect web resource project, and in that role wrote most of the content that appears on the WA part of the website. In this video interview with Debbie today, she will tell you about a finding aid she's been working on for the Department of Communities. Instead of dealing with personal files, this project looks for information about children in their administration records. It's new and it's different, and Debbie will tell you about it in her own words.
Generally, we think of welfare records in two ways. Personal files, the file that's created about you and your family that has all the information about when you went into care, why you went into care, what happened when you were in care, or might have that information. And they're the files that people are looking for. But there's another bunch of files, and let's just call them administration files. They're things like what were the policies at the time, the procedures, correspondence that the agencies kept, admission registers. They're all administrative files. The type of information that allowed a welfare agency, be it government or private, to do their work, financial records and correspondence, that sort of thing. The Restricted Archives Preservation Project, well, let's call it RAP for short, is a database that's held by the Department of Communities. It's accessible to Freedom of Information and Release of Information officers in the department, and they can search that. If you put in a request for your records, they will search that database as well as their other record systems to see if any information turns up about you. Essentially what RAP does is it extends the reach from beyond personal files into administration files and into the more obscure administration files that don't have an organisation name in the title. So it's a potential new source of information about people who may not have a personal file. I'd like to encourage record holders, private record holders, government record holders, religious organisations, to be mindful that your administration records may actually contain really valuable and worthwhile personal information that is going to make a difference to people in their lives. It'll make a difference down the generations to families, and I would encourage you to dig out all those old minutes, books, never stop looking for your admission registers and discharge registers that I know you all look for anyway, but your correspondence files, even things that are just financial records, can sometimes contain information about who was there then. It's important to know who the staff were, who visitors to the facilities were if possible. And your administration records are the place where you can find that kind of information often. And you can often find information about children in the minutes. So I know the Uniting Church Synod, Sheena Hesse, who's the archivist for Uniting Church Synod, she and a team of volunteers were able to construct a database looking at minutes of records that are now held in the Batty Library. So that assists people in being able to find records because they're searchable electronically. So please don't just give up if you can't find case records or personal files. Please preserve your administration records. And for those agencies that are still in the business of out-of-home care, please invest in records management systems so that you can easily retrieve the records that you are creating today, because down the track people will want to see them. Keep looking. I don't want to fill people with false hope, because truly and sadly for some people there'll be nothing. However, if you were told there is no personal file on you, that may be the case, but please ask again and look yourself. Say, have you checked your admin files? There must be something about me. Have you checked the minutes of, when I was there? The Parkerville board minutes or something like that. Have you checked dental providers or GPs that you had correspondence with? Is there anything about me in any of those records? And you can ask this of government, of private agencies, churches, religious bodies. Look yourself, come to the State Records Office. Staff here will help you. Many of the records they hold are restricted. They won't be able to release those records to you now, but the day may come when you'll be able to access the bits of the record that are about you from a place like this. Who knows? I mean, hopefully it will get easier for you over time. Advocate for agencies and government to do what the Department of Communities have done. Look into their administration records and make electronically searchable indexes of names so that hopefully what is there can be found. Be hopeful, be energetic in your searches, and be confident that there's hope, that there will be something, however small, there will be something about you in an administration file somewhere.
Be hopeful and be energetic, as she always does, Debbie, prompting us to think and act differently. So to lead us through the interactive workshop component of the afternoon, I would like to introduce Dr. Joanne Evans. Dr. Evans is a record-keeping researcher and educator in the Faculty of Information Technology at Monash University and is co-ordinator of the Records Continuum Research Group. Through her Connecting the Disconnected ARC Future Fellowship, she has taken up the task of convening the Setting the Record Straight initiative to develop and implement an agenda to transform record keeping and archiving around multiple rights in records. Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you, Katrina. And I'll just put my timer on. So we've got an hour to have a chance for a bit of a discussion about what we need to do next. So I'll begin as a visitor to this place to pay my respects to the elders of the Whadjuk Noongar peoples, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. And a big thank you to everybody that has made me so welcome here today. Thank you in particular to Pip and the team at Tuart Place for making today happen. They've done all the heavy lifting when it comes to organising this and organising, getting the logistics happen to have everything happen as it should on the day. And I know from the May summit that we held in Melbourne of just how much all the details that entails. So thank you very much to Pip and everybody. And it's been a real privilege to have the opportunity to come here as a follow-up to the summit. Pip and I spoke about it and we said, a small workshop where we can sort of discuss and workshop the ideas, and sort of imagined, 20 or 30 people, and it's kind of grown into 80 or 90 people and become, in effect, a mini summit. And I think, as with the summit, an important part of it is that it is about community building more than anything else, bringing together those that have been highlighting and working on these issues for many years, as well as getting some newer faces involved, because we have a big challenge in front of us and we need as many people to be part of that as possible. The second thing that struck me in organising the summit was to realise that it wasn't an endpoint, particularly given that I knew that there was many people that would have liked to be there in May that were not going to be able to make it for all sorts of reasons. So was very aware of the need to pursue these kind of follow-up activities, to communicate and share the outcomes, particularly given that one of the major ones was, as you heard in the video, the need to develop and pursue a coordinated and a long-term transformation agenda. So this session has been inspired by a couple of things. putting a couple of things together. The first is this great illustration from Matt, who was our graphic note taker at the summit, which really seemed to capture everybody's imagination, as well as the current tug of war that we have between those who have the records and those that need access to them. We have Matt's colleague Will here today to work some similar magic, and I've already won a few of his images. In particular, I can see how they'll be useful for talking about this in the future, so no pressure on him in delivering the same kind of outcomes. Yeah, but it really does, I think, just in just a great picture, just sum up what we were talking about, and then. Most important with the summit was to actually, the focus to be on the future. Okay, that's it. What do we do about it? Yeah. And I think what Deb said on the video just then too about being hopeful, that the day may come when you'll be able to more easily access the records that are about you. And I want to explore in the next hour what we might do individually and collectively to make that day come sooner rather than later. The need to, I think as the Minister said, when to stop talking about what the, I think it's important part to hear what the issues are, but then to actually take the next step and say, and this is what we're going to do about them. So when it comes to background, before we do that, to explain a little bit more about why me and also why the Faculty IT at Monash is involved in promoting this agenda. I'm an archives and record keeping researcher, and one of the big challenges for both the discipline and the profession is the development of participatory record keeping systems for the 21st century. Australian scholars have been at the forefront of advocating for this transformation around respecting and representing and enacting multiple rights in records. And that's been brought about by listening and learning from communities about their identity, memory and accountability needs that have been highlighted through the 2 decades of inquiries, apologies and responses to them. So our challenge is to design and implement a new kind of record keeping and archiving infrastructure, one that I think will feature the smart and clever use of digital and networking technologies. It's not about a technological silver bullet, it's much more complex than that, and I think much more interesting than that. But technology could have a really interesting role to play in this, but as long as we do it with the people at the centre, not the technology at the centre, I think that's a really important point to make. And so within our Faculty of IT, I want some of the best and the brightest IT minds wanting to work with us to tackle these issues. We want them to help us to design and build the more human-centred systems, and then to take those understandings and potentially apply them into other areas as well too. So that's one of my particular challenges, is to get some IT research and development in this space to help with those kind of creative solutions. So to the summit, and to quickly run through the strategic plan that's come out of it. As with the video, the world premiere, the first copies of the strategic plan have been made available for today. So there's a copy of the strategic plan and the report on each of the tables, and some little summary documentation of the communique, plus our little workshop diagram here. So again, more of Matt's fabulous illustrations. So we had our summit, and there were some of the things that we talked about the future might look like in terms of what a proper archive might be, how it would be child-centred, and how we might go about getting that next. And yes, I really love my little caricature of me that he drew as well too. So So after the summit, we sort of sat down and what we'd heard, what we'd talked about in the Planning the Future session. We had 2 sessions where the first one was about imagining this participatory record-keeping future, and then the next session was about what are the small steps that we can take now, what can happen under existing discretionary powers to work towards that. So we're going to condense that all. We had sort of 3 hours. We're going to throw that all into 1 hour here today. So in terms of what that future vision, the national framework that I spoke about in the video you saw early, so defining that, saying that it needs to be a national system. It's like we just have to stop saying that it's different. We've got, child protection legislation is different in every state, archives and records legislation is different in every state, freedom of information, privacy legislation is different in every state. We really have to stop that. We just have to think nationally and actually try and break that barrier down. So that's just really important. So we're saying if by 2020 we can have this vision defined, and then we can pursue implementing it over the next decade, implementing, monitoring, evaluating it. So it incorporates the expected recommendations from the Royal Commission on record-keeping principles for child-safe organisations, because we know the records and record-keeping recommendations that were spoken about just at the end of the last session, plus also the principles for child-safe organisation. As an archives and records person, when I read those, I see a whole lot of record-keeping implications in those as well too. So, and to hear Commissioner Murray say that, the report's going to say a lot about records and record keeping. So it's a chance for us who tend to be in the back room to actually step into the spotlight. And actually, we believe passionately that records have an important part to play in people's lives, and so this is an opportunity when other people share that passion for records, and so to be at the forefront of helping to create those systems of the future. So with those record-keeping principles, we think we need a rights-based charter for childhood record-keeping, which recognises and facilitates the participation of children in current record keeping, so that as per the national standards for out-of-home care, they have a say in the decision making that impacts on their lives. But it needs to also govern ongoing records access needs of care leavers, former child migrants, stolen generations, to more consistently, effectively and compassionately deal with the historical legacy of fragmented and distributed archives. So we again looking at that charter being a unifying charter rather than being fragmented. It's actually saying here is a set of principles which we need to apply for the records of the past, the present and also for the future. We think to do that we need an independent record keeping and rights of the child advocate who can actually be the force that makes that charter actually implemented in systems, and I guess there's both a macro level of actually developing overseeing the design and implementation of a national cross-jurisdictional, cross-sectorial legislative policy process and systems framework. But also, I think in the micro part of that is actually in each instance having that person who can actually advocate for record-keeping needs as well too. So that is something that is a big imagining, and so we need to actually, as a researcher, that's one of the things we need some research to actually work through exactly what that might look like. I guess another important piece of the puzzle is the infrastructure to support an independent lifelong living archive for every child who experiences out-of-home care, a secure, distributed, networked digital but also physical archive that's populated by children and young people themselves, by their caregivers, the caseworkers, teachers, health professionals, other people that are involved in their lives to support a child's identity, memory and time in out-of-home care and be accessible throughout his or her lifetime. And we have the opportunity with some research funding, to be able to do some research around that, what that means. And to go with that is a network governance model to define the way in which the different components integrate to form an interoperable infrastructure that can work across the jurisdictions. So to get there, we need that transdisciplinary research and development agenda so that we can make those create the blueprints of those things that we're imagining now, but actually start to turn them into blueprints for real systems. But to go with that, we need an interconnected action and advocacy agenda, and we identified at the summit themes of historical justice, transitioning and young adult needs, child-centred record keeping, and education and training as being key elements that are part of that action and advocacy agenda. So this is that further breakdown of that agenda and some of the ideas that came up around what would be in each of those themes. I guess I really want to stress that I don't see them, I see them as actually interconnected. It's like to not see them as isolated, but actually what happens in the historical justice space goes right back into the current record keeping space as well too. So to see them being part of a continuum, and the idea is that they're sort of links in a chain, and so they can only going to be as strong as the weakest links. So we need to work on getting all those elements working strong and also working together as well too. And so to do that, we wanted to focus today on the particular one highlighted there, which was the endorse and implement the Commonwealth DSS access principles and guidelines. So to use that as the basis for this exercise, while it's, yes, that's right, that's what's on your table there. So to while it sits in the historical justice category, the gold arrows there are to sort of show the way that it actually flows through to those other areas as well too. So in your little handout that I've got there, I've got a summary of the access principles so that you've got that to hand, and also a bit of information about what the guidelines cover as well too, to go with them. So we've got them there. I've got slides with the workshop questions. So I guess the first question I wanted to ask is people's familiarity with them. Who kind of knew about them before the workshop? If you want to put up your hand, it's like, is that a smattering? Okay, yes. And so if we can hear from people who are actually have heard about them and are actually trying to use them. Louise Simpson is here, and we hear that the department is using them. Yeah.
Yes, I know. I need the microphone to start with.
Yeah, done. Yes. So we thought we'd ask Louise to just tell us how she's using the guidelines.
Okay. Can you assume you can hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we've sort of all got a copy of the principles, and we use it as best we can in accordance with the other pieces of legislation, such as the FOI Act and the State Records Act. But very much some of the key points about no costs involved. For personal information, we don't charge for copies or anything like that either. There's no fee. We provide as much core identifying family information as we can, particularly sort of parents, grandparents, dates of birth, places of birth, but that essential information to help with tracing families. But obviously we do work within the confines of the other pieces of legislation, but we try and incorporate the principles as best we can within that context.
Right. Thanks, Louise. And so the other bit that's in your handout is actually an extract of the I hate to call them the redaction guidelines, because we need to almost stop calling it. We need to think about it the other way there. The how do you have maximum access? It's like how those guidelines actually say that you in this context, when we talk about third-party privacy, it's different, because that information about your parents is actually part of your private information. It's like, and so how can you actually, when it comes to dealing with these records, that heavy-handed redaction is not applied, that there's a much more sensitive and compassionate reading of the way that it should be applied, because it comes to the heart of what these records are being asked for, is to get access to that particular information, because it's going to the heart of that identity and that connection with family and community that's so important. Would anybody else who knows of the guidelines and is using the guidelines like to comment on what they're using them for? Yes. Mm-hmm. If you'd like to say where you...
Thank you. I'm Sue Thomas from Uniting Care West. We've been using them to guide our redactions, and but also the more open sense, a yes before a no, trying to come from a more compassionate place with regard to our records, and it's been really, really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good. Yes. So I guess that's the question. Is like, is saying yes before no an easy step to take? It's like that. It actually, I think, as Pip had on her slide earlier, it's like things can be made accessible and the sky doesn't fall down. It's like, so how can we get there? Would people like a little bit, like a couple of minutes to just have a quick read through of them in the light of the next questions I'm going to ask? Would that be appropriate? If we just have a couple of minutes to read through? Okay, there you go. A couple of minutes to just get familiar and have a look at the questions we're going to ask next around while they've been developed with Forgotten Australians and former child migrants in mind as they came under the Find and Connect program, are they the basis for a set of common principles and guidelines that could also apply to stolen generations, to younger care leavers and to children currently in care? So I'll give you a couple of minutes. Stolen generations, can it provide that basis that you could extend it?
Look, I'm not sure. I know I said today that we need to work together, and I look forward to that opportunity. And probably since you had the summit in May in Melbourne, we now know that the national body for stolen generations has been defunded. Right. So I'm concerned then about the national leadership. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm thinking that there's very little reference to stolen generations in the material.
Yes.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not going to bag what you're intending to do. I'm looking forward. So to me, and I've said it to some people today, at the national level there's been some head banging between our groups, and I hope that doesn't happen again. But to me, there's better potential for us to work together in regional and state levels. But I'm concerned. I saw there were Aboriginal people at the summit, and I'm hoping that their points of view were taken into consideration, as I don't see it. I guess that's all I'll say. Yes, I think for me it's important. I want to work with you all. And I think Marlene is agreeing with me, and I've had some good feedback from people in the room today. Yes, we'll work together. But let's not undercut the issues that we're facing. I'm kind of looking at it as if we're a bit of an afterthought, and I don't mean it like that, but I want us to be together. I want us to work together. And if people don't like that idea, let me know. But for me, it's too important. Our people aren't getting old. Only 4% of Aboriginal people are over 64. And that's a frightening statistic. We're lucky here. I'm 62, and there's a very small percentage of us that are over 64. So please take that into consideration when working forward. These records are very important. You heard today 54% of kids in care are Aboriginal. That shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. Yokai! It's not allowed, and we should be working together on this. We're part of your history too.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Jim. And I think it's very important that the needs of all the different communities that are coming together are actually respected. That there's a common core elements, but there's also particular requirements as well too. And so that's what we want with the initiative, for it to have that. I mean, I want to have my cake and eat it too. It's like I want to have what are the things that support together, but then what are the things that also are distinguished. And I think we do that through working together. It's like to determine what those points are, and that it certainly it was something that it was mentioned in the Royal Commission report as well too. The Records and Record Keeping Consultation paper was about the access guidelines, but they were funded under a scheme that was limited to forgotten Australian and former child migrants. And so I think we do have to test how we expand it and how it applies to other areas as well too, because it needs to, I think if the principles hopefully are quite, there's some ones that are unifying, but then also what are the particulars as well too. So I guess, can I ask you a question about, can you see a way of, you spoke about the state being a way to do that. How would you see a way forward to actually start to take those ideas and make sure that they are worked through to see how they apply in the stolen generation space? Yeah.
Well, to me, it's about empowerment, and our leadership group is developing. You heard me say we're attempting to take over the missions to return to cultural healing centres. I challenged the minister actually that do we need these group homes again? Do we need Castle Dare, Bindoon, and these places, and do it our way, where there's no pedophilia, there's no government interference with this. We do it our way, and she said, well, I'll think about that. But Roland's mission is doing it, so we need to look carefully about how the dreadful crimes of the past aren't repeated, and I think the Royal Commission is going to prevent that, one would hope. But to me, I'm probably a single person employed in this situation, and my name's Jim, not Bob, burnt out black, but we need to empower our people, because sadly they're not. And there's too much illness, there's too much death in our community, so we need to be working to prevent the dreadful close the gap issues, and empowering our people. And we can't do it in isolation. I said earlier, truth, justice and healing, we won't get reconciliation unless we have truth, justice and healing. We've got to work together and ensure these things don't happen. But it's about the empowerment of people that, my mother's 90, she's one of the last survivors from Carrolup Mission, where our people as young as 50 that are being removed, and people are still being removed younger than that. And now we've got a whole generation of people still being removed. So it's about empowerment, and my direction for me, and I hope my board will approve, is that we work closer together with Forgotten Australians and other groups that are very similar. So it's about that empowerment. I don't know whether you want to add anything, but...
Yeah, I will, actually. I just wanted to... Is this off or on?
It's on now.
Oh. I just wanted to say that there's two differences about what's happening now and the stolen generation, because the stolen generation, in its truest sense, were the people who were taken under A.O. Neville or under the West Australian statutes from anywhere all over Western Australia. And this thing that we heard the minister speak of today is because of the dysfunction that's happening.
Yeah.
And my father wasn't taken away because of the dysfunction in the family. The children today is a different social environment, and the social condition of Aboriginal people today is really quite different to what it was back then, when my grandmother and my great-grandmother were taken away. See, it's a whole different social situation, and I think historically it will prove that. Yes. So I think that there's quite a lot of work to be done.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I guess that was raised at the summit. One of the things that came out was that need for education and training. It's like to sort of really understand those historical issues and their implications. It's like to actually see that as an important element to have all sorts of different kind of awareness raising so that people, it's embedded. It's like those understandings are embedded of what the implications are. Yes, yeah. Mm.
I was sorry to take up time, but I think it's important that when we have a document like this,
Johnny,
you don't want me standing out here, but when you have a document like this, not much is about Aboriginal people. You know, where are we? That's the question. Where are we? Are we still in the consciousness of Australians, of the people here today? Obviously, yes you are. Yes we are. But there's, I'm sorry to say, you know, but I do have to say it because we do need to say why aren't the Aboriginal issues brought up in this document?
Yes,
that's what
yes,
I'm saying.
yes, and yes, I can tell you why, because of the funding bucket in which they're put in. I think Joanna Sassoon would like to say something. Yes.
Thanks. Hi everybody. And look, I just want to endorse firstly what Jim and Marlene have said about working together. And I suppose it might be a bit unfair of me to ask them a question, but can I just ask you to both of you to explain a bit about the link-up services, because I think there are some things about the link-up services that we can really learn from. But I don't know, Jim and Marlene, whether that's something you want to talk about.
Well, for me, the link-up services didn't work for me because I found more people myself. And I didn't, but there's some people in our communities who do need it. And especially the people, I have a dear friend, and he was taken as a child, I think it was 6 weeks or something like this. No, he was actually 2 weeks old. He was taken from his mother, placed in Unadatta, later on found his people at Fregon community, and he doesn't know them, you know, and I think that there has to be some more funding, if you like to say it like that, for these kinds of programs to go ahead. The stuff that Jim's doing is quite astounding, and I also think that that the link-up service itself is very valuable and needs more resources, the same as the archivists for Western Australia and for the Department of Aboriginal Affairs. They need more human resources to say, we can do all this stuff, you know, all the theoretical stuff, can make it work, and we can work with others, you know, we don't mind it.
Yes, I think it's the role that learning the healing work that has happened in the link-up services is something that I think can be shared and learned. But yes, the reason why they were only for forgotten Australians and former child migrants was because of the nature of the funding that came down, limited to that. And the question is, how do we say that no, these need to be general access principles for everybody, and they need to incorporate that diversity is really important, and it needs resourcing, human resourcing, to make it happen. Okay, so we might go on to the question.
You've covered it really, Joan. It is a funding issue. The word Aboriginal or Indigenous does not appear once in that document. Which I think is not okay. However, what we're doing with this is asking the question, does it apply to younger care leavers? Does it apply to stolen generations records? And can we use it as a unifying tool? Because Aboriginal people and younger care leavers haven't been overlooked in this document. They're entirely absent. But it was, as Joanne's saying, a document produced for a particular purpose, from a particular funding model.
Yes, yes, yes.
Stolen generation peoples had a huge debate some years back when there was a National Stolen Generations, National Sorry Day Committee. And there was some dreadful racism that occurred, which meant two national bodies were set up. The National Stolen Generation Alliance was set up because our people were removed because they had white blood. Now, what I'm hearing now is that there's a funding issue, and that's wrong. So for us, and for me in particular, my mother was taken because she had white blood, her father was Irish. Now please, let's not try and redefine this anymore. We're all Australians, we have unique issues, but to talk about funding issues, that is wrong. The Healing Foundation was set up a year after the apology. In 2009, they established a Stolen Generations Reference Group, 2013. How long is that for them to get their act together? They wanted to heal the whole of Australia. So there's been no direction from a national point of view for survivors of that removal. Let's not let that happen again. Don't say it's a funding issue. That's criminal. Because we were removed because we had white blood.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, yes. I think, yes, yeah, it's that issue of tackling how best to tackle those issues with what we've got available and to not make excuses for it. Yeah. So I think what I'd like to really take from here is that there is if we have that as one of the things, we actually really need to be aware of how limiting that idea is until we actually define the work that needs to be done to ensure that they embrace other perspectives as well too, is actually very important to take that forward. Yeah.
Just getting back to that question, Part A says, who needs to be involved in determining? Well, obviously with the stolen generation, the Indigenous people need to be, but I do understand how it crosses. I'm a forgotten Australian. As Pip knows, when I got my records, one of the statements was that Dale will never amount to anything because he associates with, and it didn't say Aboriginal, it said with dark children. Rah, rah. Years later, as I found my heritage, I found I got Indigenous descent in me. So when it comes to who needs to be involved, it has to be the people. Marlene makes a valid point that the younger care leavers are totally different to the stolen generation because that's dysfunctional families and these are other families that are stolen. So in each case, it has to be determined by the people affected, I think.
Yes, 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 yes. I guess to the role that those principles are playing is can they be the principles that can be then applied into particular circumstances, I think is what we need to check. We've got them, their existence I think is a positive step, because I think we've heard how they've been used to facilitate access and to not have those kind of heavy-handed redaction practices. But to see them, I think they're a start of actually working through rather than endpoint. It's like, it's not implement those guidelines, it's actually really look at whether they do cover everything that needs to be covered, and what are the gaps in them, and how do we actually address those gaps. And the glaring gap is their applicability across all the different areas. But then, how do we make that happen? And is what's missing from them as well too, so that they can address the issues that you've raised. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
I don't need a microphone, but as a young care leaver, I think that a representation from all parties that are involved are saying, like, there might be differences between the stolen generation and the Indigenous kids that are in care now, but they are still being failed by the state. They are still going through the issues and difficulties that these stolen generations did. It is different, yes, because it is a different time. But these kids are still going through the same issues. There is still sexual abuse, there is still all of this, and we're still trying to get the same records everybody else is. The records are the same, just different times. Everybody needs to be involved.
Yes, yeah. And I guess, one of the challenges I think we have is to, and one of the opportunities maybe that we have is with children and young people currently in care, is like, how do you actually use those principles and to have participation in the record keeping that's happening now? It's like one of the... Yes. Well, yes, I mean, they're available, but how do we actually get them so that they're actually not just guiding access in the past, but they're actually guiding the records creation that people are doing at the moment? So I think that's really important. So there's not the surprise of what your records contain. Yes. Yeah.
So that you put your child in childcare centre, and they record what happens during the day. They take photos. Mum gets to take a note. Why do we not have this for people in care? This is all we need. Something simple.
Yes.
With a child migrant,
Yes.
it's got nothing from them.
Yes.
It's simple stuff.
Yes. No, I think that's the need to work with, with the education, the way that records are created there. It's like, and learn from some of those practices around documentation. We've actually got an early childcare researcher as part of our Rights and Records by Design project, because we really want to explore the ways in which that documentation is used as such a positive force to reinforce development. It's like, and so what can we learn from that to translate into systems and into,
Natural recordings, and it shouldn't be any different in care because it's a place.
Yes.
That you are in.
That's right. Yes, and so it's the infrastructure that makes sure that we can. Yes.
I work with disabilities.
And the children cannot go home and tell their parents. They can't go home and tell their parents what they've done that day, whether they've had an outing or whatever. So they have like a chat book, everything's written down, or pictures are put in there, and also a communication book goes home, and everything that happened pretty much during the day is in that book. And it's it's a you know what I'm trying to say? It's an official document.
Yes, and it's a document that they're aware of. It's like that they're co-creating. It's like
that's right. They also respond to it, and so this is what I thought before coming here. This type of thing can happen, and you go to all the schools. The kids have got photos of themselves up around the classroom and all that stuff, so they can have that record going home. So.
Yes.
With technology too, it is just amazing what we can do.
The reason a lot of care leavers don't have as many photos is because people are not allowed to take photos of us. Oh, okay.
Yes. I think, that goes to the heart of some of the privacy challenges, which again come through in the file with the redaction side of things. I think that is a particular challenging area where the risk averseness becomes paralysing, it's like, and can actually get in the way. So that is an issue to think about, yes. Yeah.
Why can't you just have a government summit
straight away, like within 6 months, put all this issue down, and everything's on the internet these days. I mean, not that it's on the internet, but you've got electronic devices and everything. Why does everything take so long?
Yeah. Yes.
Why?
Yeah. Well, I think because it's actually complex. It's like there are privacy and security issues, and I think that's the challenge is how can we actually harness the potential in the technologies, but at the same time protect. This is personal and sensitive information, and the internet's really good for other kind of information to be broadcast. So, yeah.
Blocking documents now. Why can't you block something on the internet like you do your government? What is it? Government departments.
Yes.
What's the difference?
Yes. Oh.
Is that me?
I think that's where utilising that kind of infrastructure, the way that the infrastructure is going, is a good thing. But at the same time, at the moment, I mean, I don't know what your experiences of MyGov have been like, but it's not a very user-friendly system. And so the challenge we have is when we build these systems to build them from the person perspective rather than from the government administration perspective. And so that's why it's difficult, because all our systems are designed around designing from a government administration or an organisation administration, and we actually have to shift our thinking to that person-centred model. And yes, that is actually quite difficult. Yeah, but we, yeah.
I think there's too many bureaucrats.
You don't. Okay, stand up.
Yes. Well, again, I think that's why we want this to be. It's about that action and advocacy to put pressure on the bureaucrats. Yeah.
Sorry, Joey.
Yes. No.
Hello, I'm Lisa. I'm from Curtin University, and as an archivist and an archival educator, one of the things that I can see in these access principles to talk about this is that they are not written from the position of the child or the care leaver. They're written from a departmental access point of view. So that's the first thing to think about that actually there looks to be an attempt to write them from the child or the person who wants to access the records, but they are not, and there's confusing language and ambiguity in them. And I think that's part of the problem of why they don't address the diversity of concerns. The other thing that I was thinking about, particularly that's glaringly omitted from the access principles, and we've talked about control, you've talked about control, is why consent at the time of creation is not in access as an access principle. So about how we think about access before something is created as a principle that guides access into the future. So those are the two things I want to
Yes, and that's one of the, to get that, thinking about that as records are created and not having to then have this sort of remedial situation that we've got at the moment is actually really important. I think we have another comment there.
My name's Paddy Cannon. I'm a founding member of Forgotten Australians and Former Child Migrants, the initial body that formed our association. I've always regarded myself as a second Australian. I went to school with the first Australians at Bindi in Boys Town and Clontarf, and I've got plenty of first Australian friends to this day. And I will tell you, I've spoken to Martine and Jim today, and I've spoken to them before. We should unite a united effort together, not have a discrimination between first or second Australians. We're all Australians, and we must help each other. And that's what our mission was many years ago, and some of our founding members have gone to heaven or wherever they would like to go to, and but I will tell you that there's too much division, and we need to get together and work as a team and call ourselves Australians and get on with the business of helping the Australian people. I thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Well, I think that might get to, in the last 10 minutes, maybe let's flip to the third question there. If to have a set of principles guiding access to records, what would a 3-year plan look like to maybe it's not to endorse and implement these principles, but it's actually to develop what those principles might be, and how would you go about doing that? Yeah.
Sorry, I just had a comment just before we get on to that, so I apologise. I'm Director for Out-of-Home Care at Parkerville Children and Youth Care, so we grapple with this on a daily basis, that balance between doing the client work and then recording the work. I was also in child protection prior to that, so some of my observations in records keeping, because it's something that I'm really, really passionate about and try to keep my whole team to account, it's not explicitly clear in government contracts what should be recorded when an NGO takes on that. So there are some overarching, expectations of what's recorded, but at the moment we're going through the out-of-home care reform. It's not very specific. That could be directed through those contracts for NGOs to keep a very similar standard of record keeping. So that's, I guess, one element that's missing. The other thing that I think is really, really ambiguous is who owns the record. Is it the child? Is it the legal guardian? Is it the NGO? And when a child is placed with an NGO, we keep records, and the Department for Child Protection also keep records on that child. So there needs to be some clarity as to who actually owns the record. And if it's the child that owns the record, absolutely fine. We shouldn't even need access principles or guidelines if the child owns the record. But I don't think that's clear at the moment as to who owns the record. One of the issues the Department for Child Protection over, I'll speak on behalf of Parkerville, we keep a client file. It's for an individual child. In the Department for Child Protection, it's a family file. So it's very difficult for children and young people to access documents specifically related to them when you could have a multitude of people in that file. So very hard to sift through, and whether or not that needs to be considered down the track, both for government and for NGO, whether there's benefits or costs to either of those types. Consistency in guidelines. Every NGO and state government would have different requirements as to what they consider to be kept in records. It can be very subjective, and I think quality of record keeping would be far better if it was really clear about what should and shouldn't be included. Some of the principles that were mentioned today from the Royal Commission were great and provide a lot of clarity, but I don't think that goes far enough. And one of the other things I wanted to mention is, and I'm speaking on behalf of an NGO, but one of the issues with NGOs and record keeping is that NGOs are not resourced sufficiently to spend the money on the infrastructure to actually, keep those electronic records. So we're given X amount of money and we're trying to maximise service delivery for clients. So whether or not at a state government or a national level, there's the software. We have a variety of different ways of collecting data, whether it's through homelessness and that, whether or not there could be a standard way of collecting that information so that whether you're an NGO or a state government department, and whether you're in Western Australia or South Australia, that everybody is able to collect and input the same types of records for children and young people, so there's some consistency for them in the future. Yes. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but it was just some observations that I've made in my time in the field.
Yes. No, I think that theme of consistency, again, is just rife throughout this. It's like to make that, what is that infrastructure that will have consistent record-keeping practices for children and young people currently in care, but I think also the consistency then extending all the way through. We heard about the different access regimes that people have to navigate. So how can we make them more consistent? I guess that's one of the things that in working together on what the principles and guidelines might be, what a framework might be for accessing records in WA, it's like who needs to be involved in kind of taking the things that are there that might be helpful and turning them into that consistent framework is, I guess, the question that we're talking about here. Yeah. There we go.
Sorry, just the last question.
Yes, yes.
Summing up and identifying next steps ahead. So just
one last question.
Hi, I'm Leonard Jones, and I'm from Tuart Place, and I'm an out-of-home care leaver. One of the things that seems to be becoming quite obvious, you say what would a 3-year plan to endorse and implement WA look like? Well, I'd say that the first thing, order of business would be to standardise information collected by any organisation that's involved with children, government, NGO, religious, whatever. So then you know what information is being collected by an organisation. Then you can start from there. I don't think you can possibly do it any other way, because you're still going to have that confusion. That's just coming from my point.
Yes. I guess it comes down to that need for those, to again the system that underpin a system that's distributed across so many organisations, the need for that unifying infrastructure that supports to make things more consistent. Do we want to? I guess, I think we probably took on a bit too much in this hour session to sort of focus on that. But I think it just sort of I guess what we were trying to get to was the issue of how do we work with the things that are already on the table and how do we make them better? It's like, how do we say that it's not a blank page that we're dealing with? There's an awful lot of things that are good that we can build from. But at the same time, I think there's always in this the struggle of the fact that sometimes some of the issues are so deep-seated they need that longer-term commitment to actually to make difference. So from my perspective, that strategic plan that we've got is a work in progress. It's like it's going to continue to be developed, and so if anybody has any thoughts and ideas about what you'd like to see encompassed in that, then please let me know, because this problem is bigger than all of us, and it's really important that we have a strategy that is unifying, that identifies the issues that we need to work on, that does have some things that people can do now to make a difference, but at the same time we also have to work on the more deep-rooted and the systemic problems, because otherwise we will be continuing to come back and having these conversations around why things aren't working. So thank you very much.
Well, we did indeed open a can of worms, which we knew we were going to do. That's fine. It's a complicated, complex issue that we're talking about. I'd like to introduce to you Maria Harries, AM, PhD, who is a Senior Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Western Australia and Adjunct Professor at Curtin University. As well as working on ways to retire, she continues to manage a portfolio of activities including organising a household, supervising research and PhD candidates, undertaking national consultancies related to the welfare of children and families, and holding a number of board positions including at Tuart Place and Lottery West. Maria has been charged with the fairly difficult task of identifying some of the key themes from today, some of her reflections, and identifying what we hope is a way to work together going forward. Thank you, Maria.
I knew I was summing up. I didn't know I was working out how you're all going to move forward. But I do have some ideas. And I wanted to start, it's not coming up there. I wanted to start just by honouring Laurie Humphreys, who was the man who set up FACT, Forgotten Australians Coming Together here. And he died now some years ago, but whenever Laurie spoke, he said, if we can't make it better for people like us in the past, we can make it better for people in the future. And we've got to make it better for the kids in the future. So I've had that in my head all day as I've been jotting some things down and thinking about the two big issues. One is about accessing records from the past, and one is about making it better for the future for kids. And certainly I take Marlene's point and Jim's point absolutely. Different past stories, but the stories of today are not just about dysfunctional families. They're actually about systemic problems that we have. They are actually about poverty and adversity and disadvantage affecting different kids and different families and different communities. So that's where I'm starting. I want to go to the end. It's not going to work. You should always try these things out before. So that's. I'm just trying to remember what I've been struck by today. I said to a couple of people, we in the West do things really well, and I think those in the East should learn from us. No. And I just think the fact that we have this group in this room together is fantastic, because we've got all of the key players. I couldn't agree with Jim and Marlene more. We've had a fractured past. We have forgotten Australians, we've got former child migrants, and we've got the stolen generation. Jim, you're absolutely right. It's time we got our act together and worked together forwards, and we should all have access to the same systems into the future. So I want to park that. I might have to ignore this and just try and remember. So that's really important for me. The second one is there's been a lot said from the experience of great. What I've done is I've just kept an ongoing record, and then I summarised it. Up. Okay. So I'm told I can't look at both screens. Okay, thank you. So Laurie's words. The other point I wanted to make is there's nothing like an idea whose time has come, and there's no doubt in my mind at all that the issue of record keeping from the past into the future, the idea and the issue is here. I first started teaching about record keeping 25 years ago and realised that nobody listened. The other thing is that I think when we're talking about records, we must always remember that they are actually written by diverse people for different reasons. I've just reviewed a situation of a child who was only in care for 2 years in another state. I had, I think, about 50 large folders of information that came to me. We're not talking about the sorts of records now that we talked about 30 and 40 and 50 years ago. We're talking about massive records that go between lawyers and others that are written for different audiences, for NGOs, for non-government organisations, and they are massive. So it's no longer a simple job, and as Debbie Rosa said, a lot of them are administrative records too. So Parkerville will hold records, and various other NGOs will hold similar records. And the ones I looked at for this other state, there were 18 non-government organisations involved with this child in the 2-year period and her family. So we're really talking about a very complicated system now when we talk about accessing records. So why has it taken so long? I think partly because the people who are most affected by the poverty of our system have not been sufficiently well heard until now. I think the Royal Commission has done us an enormous service, and it's because the men and women who were affected have finally got a voice, and so the voice is here in this room and it's got to continue. And the other point I made, of course, is that we've been a divided group. I've said that records are kept for multiple purposes. So reflecting on past records, this is what has been said: have hope and keep searching, expect and demand support, be part of the change we want to see, and empowerment starts with us. Do you want to say anything? Do you want to...
Well, I'm definitely on par with everything you've said, and I think we do all need to unite as one, because we're facing the same issue but from different angles, and it's just messy. It's like a cat with a string, it's everywhere. We need to ball up this string as a team and as one. There is no difference between us, in my opinion. I'm sorry, I'm one of those people that there is no difference between us except for we're fighting the same cause. And I'm a very outspoken person, and it's taken me a lot to get to where I am with my case file as an outspoken person, so I can imagine what it's like for someone that doesn't have the confidence and the personality I do. And for someone like me to have given up, that's saying something's wrong. I don't easily give up, and that's the process. I've just chucked it out the window.
So we're all learning from you. So there's no excuses about moving forward. We need to fundamentally change the way records are kept to enable lifelong identity and memory. Some questions were asked earlier, and I think absolutely so correct. When records are written, there needs to be an understanding of who they're being written for, and that there are multiple audiences. Please, no.
When I went through my training and we did assignments on case notes, I got an A, just so you know. But we were told to write it like you're writing it to the person that is going to read it.
Yeah.
You're writing it for these, I'm going to say young people just because that's in my head, but you're writing it for these young people to read. And I think that really needs to be reiterated with everybody that is writing these case notes, because we will eventually read them, and we want to read them, like you said, in a way that we can understand. Like, there's been words today that I'm like, what? What is that? Yeah. And I think that comes a lot with, especially young people growing up in care, they've maybe not had the best education, they've not had the best opportunities to gain the knowledge that is to read these official documents that probably mean shit, because they don't know what they mean, they don't know what this sentence says.
And it's really important also when people read their records that we help them to have an understanding of why they were written. And talking to workers in another state where I've been working, the social workers told me they were very clearly, when they wrote their legal reports, they were being required to write in order to convince the legal system that this child needed to be in care. So what they wrote wasn't really palatable, wouldn't have been palatable to hear, because they wouldn't win if they made it palatable. So in a sense, that's a part of the reading of the story that people need to understand. Just moving on.
Also, there's the other part of it, I think you touched on, was when you're reading the files, you actually need support.
Yes, I think.
I hear that all the time.
Yeah, and I think you need to have someone with you, unless, or either with you or to go to a place to get counselling and some kind of help.
I'm going to pay support. My knowledge primarily in young people in care, or I've been in care recently, so I'm sorry if I sound like I'm just focused on one group, but that's my knowledge. Is that a lot of these young people have suffered mental health issues as well, so this can trigger and bring up a lot of things, and it can be detrimental to their mental health to read this by themselves without fully being able to understand it, so not taking it in a way that maybe it was intended or meant to be. And with all of these blanks, you fill in your own story. So you're filling in the blanks with your own words, and that might not be what's actually happened. So you formed your own story, and it can be worse than what is actually in that file.
Absolutely. There are days gone by, thankfully they've finished, where people actually got their records sent to them in the post. And yeah, so hopefully that doesn't happen anymore.
I got mine sent to me just 2 years ago.
2 years ago.
A big express postcard like that got sent to me. Disgusting. Yeah, so it is still happening.
Yeah.
So I'm listening to you speak and I'm like, wow, this is awesome. but
it's actually happening. Like, it's okay to say everything like this is what it's supposed to be. Like, same with those guidelines. It's okay to say that that's what's supposed to happen, but when it's not happening, and I know that some of the things on there, from what not only my own experience but from the other voices that I've heard is that it's not happening. It's not about what's written on a piece of paper.
So we've only just started this conversation, haven't we, today, really? In the West. They've started it, we've been... But here, with this group of people, we've only just started. And there are some really important learnings we've done and that have been recorded today. We do need to move on because everybody needs to go home, I think, sometime. I think the important issue of harnessing participatory record keeping in some form or other, understanding why you're keeping records and that they can be read by people you're writing about, seems to have eluded a lot of people over the past. It mustn't elude them any further. And we do need to harness technology. It was a great start to just look at the principles, but I have many questions about how to make them real. I really appreciated the comment that was made that they weren't developed through the eyes of a child, and I think that is absolutely crucial. They do need to apply to all stolen generations. So I've got some questions. Who's going to continue to lead the change in WA? But someone needs to be... when we developed FIND all those years ago, when Debbie Rosa developed FIND with the former child migrants, it was really important to have a small group of key thinkers and influential people, like the Auditor General, etc., together, so that the difference was made. Now, I don't want to name anybody in the room. He's just gone. That's why I mention never leave early. But there are people, if we want to see change happen, you've got to get people who can make a difference into the room together. So, Pip, you started this off with Joanne, and Ron, of course. Getting the group together is crucial. And we need to link up, all of us, at that time. Is the FOI the appropriate guide for access to see child protection and out-of-home care data in this state? I don't think so, but I'm not going to say any more than I don't think so, because I wouldn't have a clue how to change it. But and I asked Tara earlier if that was the case, Tara, and you said you were going to find out more. So Tara might be somebody to have at the table. I could start pointing out, but I'm not going to. If it's not appropriate, how to change it? Someone else can find that answer. How can the access principles be altered to be looked at through the eyes of the child? I've asked that already. And having consent as an access principle seems to be such a crucial understanding. If you're going to write about somebody, they need to know that you're writing about them, but there needs to be an arrangement about what can be said and what can't be said. Pardon? Some sort of conversation about, this is your story. I'm going to finish there, but I just want to congratulate everybody for staying cool. Because it's hard to be cool when you feel so emotional about things, and particularly the care leavers in the room, many of whom I know who haven't been able to find their records and have found appalling records when they have found them. So I have huge admiration. At the very beginning, Marlene, you made comment about the courage in the room. And I just wanted to say, I think in WA we have done enormously well because we've had people of courage from all sides meet together. So I'm leaving you with the knowledge that someone is going to organise to get a little group together of influential people and keep this moving on. And Pip, I'm assuming people will be advised? Yes. Yeah. Pip is now going to have the very last word.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much. And thank you to another clever young man who made the technology work. Where is he? Yeah. Thank you, Joanne, for getting the ball rolling. Joanne is a real gift to this sector. She's come in with a fresh pair of eyes and a fresh approach, taking a broad look and proposing a unifying framework. And I think that to me, that is the potential for today, for there to be unity, for all our services to work together, for the different parts of the sector, for young people, for stolen generations, to be part of a unified cause. You know, united we stand, divided we fall. Yeah, that's it. So we're happy to act as a point of contact. We would love to hear from you if you want to be part of an ongoing project. We need to do something, clearly. Today has revealed that in spades. So once again, thank you all very much for coming along. Yeah.